Tonight, imagine the glow of rushlights trembling against oak-paneled walls, their smoke curling slowly toward beams blackened by centuries of fire. A chamber heavy with the scent of beeswax and lavender sachets holds a mirror of polished silver, cloudy and imperfect. You lean close to it, the way an Elizabethan lady might, and in that distorted surface you see your face pale, or perhaps not pale enough. Pale is the color of virtue here. Pale is the currency of favor, and so the chase for whiteness begins. You'd probably never make it through a single medieval night. But don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from, maybe lying awake in New York, or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey. Together, here on Timeless Sleep. The Elizabethan court prized appearance almost as much as loyalty, and beauty was not a gentle affair. Picture a lady standing in the draughty chamber of a manor house, servants bustling around with pots and brushes. Onto her skin goes a paste of ceruse, a deadly blend of vinegar and white lead, to erase freckles, sunburn, or even the honest tan of outdoor labor. It hardens into a mask that cracks if she smiles too wide, but that mask is demanded, for pallor signals privilege. Sun-touched skin means fieldwork, and fieldwork means poverty. The line between admired and scorned is painted directly on the face. You notice how the candles flicker against this chalky surface, giving her a ghost-like glow, almost saintly, almost sick. This is the irony. The very thing that makes her look angelic also poisons her, seeping silently into blood and bone. Lead attacks slowly, the stomach aches, the trembling hands, the hair falling like brittle straw. Yet still, every morning the paste is reapplied, because without it, she risks invisibility in a court where attention is survival. The cruelty hides in plain sight. Beauty is a performance, but one paid for in body and breath. Even the men joined the theatre, though their faces bore less punishment. Powdered cheeks and rouged lips could be worn, but rarely did they suffer the same extremes. For women, it was relentless. A lady's maid might gently brush on layers of the paste while whispering prayers that her mistress does not sicken too quickly. Everyone knew the dangers, and yet the jars of white powder kept selling, passed from London apothecaries to noble houses. Think of it as the Elizabethan version of knowingly drinking 3 energy drinks in a row. You know it's unwise, but still, you crave the effect. And so, women painted not only for admiration, but also for strategy. In a court ruled by a queen, beauty was political. A pale face opened doors to patronage, to advantageous marriages, to whispers in royal corridors. Without that mask, you might vanish into the margins, your prospects dimming as surely as the candle when its wick burns too short. In this way, the brutality lay not only in the materials, but in the necessity. Refuse, and you risk obscurity. Obey, and you surrender your health. Servants and onlookers could only watch. The irony is that while noble women poisoned themselves with lead, the poorer women envied them. A milkmaid, browned by sun and wind, might glance longingly at portraits of painted ladies and sigh, not realizing the cost hidden behind the ivory skin. It is a reminder that beauty standards, however brutal, are rarely acknowledged as such in their own time. They are simply the air one breathes, the rules of the game. You can almost hear the scrape of brushes across porcelain bowls, grinding chalk into finer powder, stirring it into vinegar with a wooden spoon. The mixture hisses faintly, acidic, pungent. Applied with care, it blurs blemishes, but at the edges of the jaw, it flakes, leaving little crumbs that betray the artifice. Women carried hand mirrors, adjusting constantly, aware that one wrong gesture might reveal the deceit. Imagine the pressure of never being allowed to forget your own mask. Occasionally, physicians protested. They wrote pamphlets, warning of lead's corrosive bite, describing symptoms in grisly detail: blackened gums, corroded flesh, miscarriages. And yet, the fashion endured. Much like warning labels today, people read them with a half smile and carried on anyway. After all, if the queen herself painted her face in layers of surus, who dared to appear bare? Elizabeth's mask of youth was famous. Even as she aged, she maintained the pale visage, making her courtiers copy her. To defy her was to court disaster. The painters of portraits joined the conspiracy. They smoothed faces into porcelain perfection, elongating features, softening shadows. To look at an Elizabethan miniature is to see not reality, but an aspiration. Skin without pores, cheeks without scars. And so, women compared themselves not to each other, but to idealized paintings that no human skin could ever match. Sound familiar? It should, because centuries later the airbrushed magazine cover plays the same cruel trick. The tools change, but the trap remains. In candlelit halls, laughter often mingled with coughing, perfume mingled with the acrid tang of vinegar. A noblewoman might excuse herself from a dance not because her slippers pinched, but because her stomach twisted with the effects of poison. Still, she returned, repowdered, lips freshly stained. It was less about comfort and more about maintaining the illusion. The theatre never ended, day or night. One had to look the part. The brutality did not always wear the face of suffering. Sometimes it wore the face of ridicule. Gossip swirled like smoke through court corridors. Too much paint, and you were mocked for looking clownish. Too little, and you were pitied for appearing rustic. Imagine trying to hit that impossible sweet spot. Pale enough to prove status, natural enough to deny the artifice. The line was razor thin, and the price of failure was shame. Even outside the court, the obsession trickled down. City wives in London copied the look, though their mixtures were often cruder. Some used flour dusted across cheeks, others a paste of egg whites that tightened into a shiny mask. These substitutes might peel or smell, but they mimicked the elite. The brutality, then, was not confined to palaces, but seeped into taverns and marketplaces, a shadow over every woman who dared to be seen. Think, too, of the physical discomfort. That hardened mask cracked at every laugh, every smile, every tear. Women learned to speak softly to keep their faces still, a kind of emotional corset for the skin. Discretion itself became dangerous, another cruelty added to the list. Even joy had to be managed so the mask would not betray its wearer. You might say Elizabethan women invented the art of resting face centuries before memes named it, and yet, under the candlelight it worked. In those golden glows the powdered faces shone ethereal, like alabaster statues brought to life. Men praised the angelic look, forgetting the jars, the brushes, the servants who laboured behind the scenes. Beauty seemed effortless, which was the greatest trick of all. Hours of work, layers of poison, and still the compliment came. You look natural, untouched. The lie had to be maintained, even believed. The cycle continued with each generation. Mothers taught daughters the recipes, whispering them as secrets of womanhood. Some recipes bordered on the absurd: crushed pearls in vinegar, pigeons boiled down for fat to soften skin. A particularly strange one involved a mixture of mercury and egg whites, applied at night, meant to create a glow by morning. Imagine trying to sleep with your face encased in such a concoction, praying it did not slide onto your pillow. And yet, through all this, women carved out small acts of rebellion. Some dabbed rouge more boldly, refusing the pale fragility ideal. Others left freckles uncovered, daring the court to scorn them. It was not always successful, but even within oppressive standards, small defiance flickered. Like the candles in those smoky rooms, rebellion was fragile, but not entirely extinguished. Looking back now, it is easy to laugh at the cracked masks, the absurd recipes, the obsession with veins painted blue to mimic translucence. But laughter should be soft, because behind each absurdity was a woman's real body, real suffering. The brutality of beauty was not simply the poison, it was the way life itself bent around it, shaping gestures, marriages, and even the ability to breathe freely. In the end, you step back from the silver mirror, watching that pale face blur and dissolve in its cloudy surface. The candles sputter lower, shadows creep across the floorboards, and you sense the weight of performance that never ceased. Painted faces smiled, but behind them flesh and bone ached with the cost. It is a haunting theatre, one that whispers across centuries. The price of beauty has always been heavier than it looks, and as the night grows still, you carry the echo of those painted faces into your own quiet room. The cruelty of Elizabethan beauty was not hidden in some dungeon or battlefield, but right there, every day, painted onto cheeks, whispered through corridors, demanded by glances. Even now, when you pass a mirror and see your own reflection, you might wonder how much of what you see is yours and how much is the world's demand. The pale mask of the Elizabethan lady was only the beginning. Beneath the crackling layer of paint, another weapon waited: powder. Tonight, picture a long wooden table in a draughty chamber, lined with glass jars stoppered with cork. Some hold chalk, some ground alabaster, some the deadly ceruse of lead and vinegar. A maid dips her fingers into one jar, lifts the fine white dust into the air, and it drifts like mist across the lamplight. She pats it onto her mistress's skin until the face gleams with a brightness almost unearthly. This powder was not gentle. It sank into pores, lodged in lungs, and clung stubbornly to hair and lashes. What seemed like soft snow was in truth a creeping poison, one that would gnaw away at the body long after the candles had been blown out. Powder was everywhere. It was dusted onto cheeks, pressed into wigs, shaken onto collars, and carried in little boxes tucked into sleeves. The more fashionable a lady, the more clouds of it surrounded her. Step into a great hall at festival time, and you would have seen the air itself shimmering with powder, each guest trailing a faint haze, the floor slick with fallen dust. It must have looked like walking through a foggy dawn, though the scent of vinegar and chalk betrayed its true nature. The cruelest part was not its visibility, but its invisibility. Tiny motes inhaled into the chest, settling silently, choking slowly. And yet, the risk did not deter. To wear powder was to wear power. It was a badge of leisure, of wealth, of belonging. No sun-browned field worker could ever match it. Their skin carried proof of labor, but a powdered lady erased that history from her face, presenting herself as a creature above toil. In portraits, the skin glowed with a luminescence no candle could create naturally. Artists leaned into it, painting nobles as smooth as ivory dolls. The lie became the truth in paint, and so women doubled their efforts to look like their portraits. Imagine the process each morning. Servants bring basins of water, already faintly sour from vinegar used to cleanse the skin. Then comes the scraping, removing yesterday's layer with linen cloths, until the skin burns. Next, a fresh application of ceruse, thick and wet, drying into a crust. Finally, powder patted over top, sealing the mask. The woman cannot smile too much, cannot eat too eagerly, cannot touch her face without risking collapse of the fragile shell. Her beauty is not her own. It belongs to the mixture in the jars. It is a costume she cannot take off without revealing the damage beneath. Physicians of the time, some more bold than others, documented the effects with grim detail. They described ulcers blooming along jawlines, teeth blackening at their roots, hairlines receding as if the face itself fled from the mask. Lead poisoned the blood, causing trembling hands, miscarriages, and memory loss. A courtier might forget names, stumble in her speech, and still be praised for her glowing skin. The irony was stark. The more perfect the face, the more ruined the body. But who dared to mention it when silence preserved reputations? Powder also carried its own indignities. It clung to clothing, leaving white streaks on velvet gowns. Lovers who leaned close might find themselves dusted, like loaves of bread. Dances became comical when partners emerged with smudges on their doublets. There is one story of a nobleman who sneezed mid-banquet and left his sleeve coated in white, prompting laughter across the table. Imagine trying to flirt while coughing up the very mask that was meant to make you desirable. Yet still, the jars kept being refilled, the powder boxes kept being passed down as heirlooms, and there was expense. High-quality ceruse came from Venice, its importation costly and prestigious. To own it was to show connection, wealth, and refinement. But the poor bought cheaper imitations, mixing chalk with flour, or even bread dust. These cracked more quickly, flaked onto food, and spoiled in damp weather. Yet no one wished to be seen without some pale covering, even if it meant raiding the pantry for powder. The brutality was economic as well as bodily, a demand that emptied purses along with veins. The danger extended beyond women. Powdered wigs for men soaked up dust, which then drifted down to skin and lungs. Young pages and boys, tasked with brushing and applying the powders, inhaled clouds of it daily. Their coughing was dismissed as weakness. You can almost picture them, sleeves rolled up, patting powder onto their masters while their own throats burned. Beauty standards spared no one who lived in their orbit. But powder had a social language too. To appear without it was to risk being read as careless, immoral, even unfeminine. The pale face signaled chastity and restraint, while bare skin suggested coarseness or lust. A woman's morality could be judged in a glance at her complexion. It was unfair but effective. One flush too many, one blemish exposed, and gossip began. The cruelty was that skin told lies others insisted on believing. Artists and poets encouraged the obsession. Shakespeare himself wrote lines praising lily hands and ivory brows, setting alabaster skin as a metaphor for purity. These images sank into the culture, making women's bodies into canvases for symbolism they had never asked for. To be pale was to be angelic. To be darkened by sun was to be marked. Even today, echoes remain. Sunscreen commercials, filters that brighten skin tones, entire industries built on erasure. The Elizabethans did not invent the cruelty, but they perfected its theatre. Consider the ritual of reapplication during feasts. A woman excuses herself, slipping behind a tapestry or into a side chamber. Servants scurry with powder boxes. She sits, still as marble, while her face is patted back into place. Then she returns to the hall, her smile intact, her mask restored. No one mentions the absence. No one mentions the labour, but everyone knows the unspoken rule. Beauty must appear effortless, even if it takes an army to achieve. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same lie behind "I woke up like this." The powder could not hide everything, of course. By candlelight the cracks showed. Men joked about women melting near the fire, their paint sliding down like wax. Sometimes it did. A summer ball might leave a noble woman streaked with rivulets of white and pink, the mixture undone by sweat. Servants rushed to repair her, but the embarrassment lingered. Laughter at such accidents was common, but beneath it lay fear. If the mask failed, the woman herself failed. And what of intimacy? Imagine the dread of being seen in the morning, the mask worn away. Husbands sometimes recoiled at the sight of sores, wrinkles, or stained teeth revealed beneath the powder. Some accused their wives of deception, as if the mask had been meant to fool rather than survive. It was a double cruelty, forced to wear poison to gain admiration, then punished when the poison revealed itself. The bedchamber was no refuge from the tyranny of powder. Yet some took pride in their mastery of it. Manuals circulated, filled with recipes and advice, how to blend powders, how to layer them, how to remove them with egg whites or rosewater. For some women, it became a craft, a science even, passed like family knowledge. The ingenuity was real, though always shadowed by the hidden cost. You might admire the skill and still wince at the consequences, and occasionally, strange superstitions crept in. Some claimed that moonlight itself could whiten the skin if one stood outside at night, face tilted upward. Others recommended bathing in donkey's milk or rubbing crushed snails on blemishes. Compared to lead, these remedies were harmless, but they reveal the desperation to achieve the standard without paying the price. In that desperation, you hear echoes of every fad diet, every miracle cream advertised centuries later. Humanity has always chased shortcuts to impossible ideals. The tragedy of powder was not only physical but emotional. Women learned to distrust their own reflection. Was the admiration in the courtier's eyes for them, or for the powder? Were they truly beautiful, or only their mask? Imagine carrying that question into every interaction, never knowing if love or friendship saw you or your disguise. The poison did not only eat at the flesh, it gnawed at certainty, identity, and self-worth. By the end of a long day, the face often looked ruined. The powder mixed with sweat, smudged by hands, darkened by candle smoke. A woman's mirror might reveal not porcelain smoothness, but a grotesque patchwork of grey and white. Still, the process would begin again the next morning, because there was no alternative. Like a wheel turning endlessly, the cycle of painting and erasing went on, grinding body and spirit beneath its weight. And so, as the chamber grows quiet and the jars of powder stand waiting in their rows, you sense the true brutality. It was not only in the lead, not only in the powder, but in the way life itself became entangled with them. To be seen at all was to be powdered, and to be powdered was to be poisoned. The women of Elizabeth Court learned to breathe through chalk, to smile through pain, to dance through coughs. They built their lives upon dust, and in dust their beauty often ended. In the flicker of candlelight, pale faces were never left unadorned. Tonight, picture a long oak table crowded with tiny pots and brushes, their bristles stiff with pigment. Beside the jars of white ceruse lies another tool of transformation, vermilion paste for the lips. You watch a woman, her fingers steady despite the weight of her gown, dip a brush into the bright red mixture. She dabs carefully, drawing color over lips that only moments ago looked bloodless under their lead mask. The effect is startling, even theatrical, a flash of scarlet against a field of chalk. To Elizabethans, those red lips signaled vitality, youth, even desirability, yet behind them lurked rot, both literal and figurative. Teeth blackened from sweet wines, and spoiled gums still bared themselves through the crimson frame, a paradox both cruel and inescapable. The truth was that Elizabethans loved sugar, a luxury recently flooding England through trade. Sugar was eaten in candied fruits, sweetmeats, and spiced wines. It glittered at banquets, sculpted into elaborate shapes, but with sweetness came decay. Teeth rotted quickly, blackening until some mouths resembled crumbling ruins more than smiles. A noblewoman, whose fortune could buy her sugar daily, might actually suffer worse dental ruin than the peasants who could not afford such treats. Imagine the irony. The very wealth that marked her status carved rot into her grin. Yet rather than abandon sugar, women turned to paint. Black teeth became oddly fashionable in certain circles, a twisted badge of wealth. Some women even darkened their healthy teeth with soot to mimic the effect of sugar's ruin, signaling they could afford such indulgence. So, while they painted lips red to mimic youth, they blackened teeth to mimic decay. It was a cruel theatre of contradictions, the pursuit of allure entangled with the embrace of ruin. If it sounds absurd, remember we still buy jeans ripped to tatters and call it style. Behind the glamour, the practicalities were harsh. Tooth powders of the era contained abrasive substances like pumice, brick dust, or crushed seashells. These wore down enamel, worsening decay. Mouth rinses might include vinegar or even urine, believed to whiten teeth, but often burning the gums instead. So, a woman's smile was always a battlefield, her teeth caught between sugar's assault and remedies that hurt more than they healed. To cover the damage, rouge became essential. Paint your lips bright enough, and perhaps the eyes would never linger on the teeth. Some recipes for rouge were harmless, crushed cochineal beetles mixed with gum or egg whites, but others carried their own poisons. Cinnabar, rich with mercury, could be blended into lip pastes, seeping slowly into the body through tender skin. Think about it. Women smeared toxins onto their mouths. The very threshold of life. The place of eating, speaking, kissing. The danger could not be more intimate, more insidious, yet without the paint, their smiles were judged harshly, and their very worth questioned. Men, of course, could flaunt rotting teeth without consequence. A nobleman with stained or missing teeth might still be called handsome if his estates were rich enough. His reputation rested not on appearance but on lineage and land. Women, however, carried their families' fortunes in their faces, their beauty part of the bargaining table in marriage contracts. To let one's looks decay was to risk not only ridicule but also financial ruin, so they endured the paints, the powders, the pain, because survival often wore the mask of beauty. At court, the effect was dazzling from a distance. Candlelight softened harsh lines of painted lips, making them glow like embers. Dancers swirled, gowns rustling, jewels catching the firelight, and everywhere those crimson mouths smiled, whispered, and plotted. Up close the cracks showed, the smell of spoiled teeth, the strange shimmer of paint in the sweat. But in the theatre of politics, no one cared about closeness. Beauty was a stage set, and women were the actors, whether they wished to perform or not. The cruelty extended beyond the body into reputation. A woman who refused to paint her lips risked being called sickly, or worse, barren. Bright colour meant fertility, the promise of children, while pale lips whispered weakness. Imagine living in a world where a shade of red could define your value as a mother. And yet, women bore it with grace, painting carefully each morning, lips pressed thin until dry, then waiting as the paint hardened into a stiff smile. Gossip sharpened the knife further. Too much rouge, and you were accused of vanity, even wantonness. Too little, and whispers claimed you were ill or disinterested in maintaining your husband's favour. The line was impossible to hold. Somewhere between the too bright clown and the too pale ghost lay an ideal that no one could truly capture. But failure was never private. The court was a hall of mirrors, every glance another judgment. Consider, too, the physical discomfort. Rouge mixed with mercury or vinegar burned the lips. Women learned to purse their mouths carefully, avoiding laughter that might crack the paint. Eating became a negotiation, every bite a risk to smudge or stain. Some noble women avoided strong meats or greasy dishes, choosing instead candied fruits that further rotted their teeth. So the cycle tightened. Sugar spoiled the smile, paint hid the spoilage, sugar was chosen again for safety, and the ruin deepened. It was a trap disguised as a feast. Yet not all solutions were so grim. Some women favoured herbal remedies, rubbing sage leaves on gums, chewing cloves to mask odour. These offered moments of relief, but they could not compete with the glamour of bright pigment. A sage-rubbed mouth smelled sweet, but looked ordinary. A painted mouth, even burning with mercury, commanded attention. And in Elizabeth's court, attention was everything. The Queen herself set the pattern. Elizabeth painted her lips a deep vermilion, her portraits showing a mouth bright against her snowy skin. Courtiers copied her relentlessly, knowing that to mirror her appearance was to declare loyalty. Even as she aged and her teeth rotted away, she clung to the red paint, her lips a banner of power against time. And so her ladies followed, lips painted even when their own smiles cracked beneath. Imagine the power of one woman's mouth shaping the fates of hundreds. The tragedy is that behind the mask, women laughed, loved, and lived, just as we do. They whispered secrets to friends, pressed lips to children's cheeks, sipped wine slowly at night, but each gesture was shadowed by the mask. A kiss might leave a smear of vermilion, a laugh might reveal blackened teeth. A secret shared might be scented with spoiled gums. Even their most human moments were haunted by the brutality of beauty. Think of the portraits that remain. We look at them now and see elegance, dignity, mystery. But if you could step closer, smell the breath, feel the powder, you would know the truth. Those women endured a daily ritual of harm to appear as the paintings promised. The portraits are lies, but beautiful lies, and lies powerful enough to shape history. It is the same paradox we face when scrolling filtered images today, admiration tangled with quiet unease, and yet there was humour even then. Writers mocked the painted mouths, jesters whispered jokes about kisses that tasted of vinegar. One pamphleteer described women's faces as dough baked too hard in the oven, their lips smudges of the devil's ink. Cruel, yes, but also evidence that people saw through the act, even while demanding it. The joke was always on the women, though, never on the men who required the act in the first place. In taverns, meanwhile, ordinary women found their own balance. A dab of berry juice, a smear of beetroot, something that washed away easily, less dangerous, less costly, but still an echo of the court standard. Even milkmaids learned to redden their lips on feast days, eager not to be left behind. The cruelty was contagious, trickling down through every rung of society, until even those least able to afford it sacrificed health for beauty. At the end of the night, when the banquet was over and the candles burned low, women retired to chambers where basins of water waited. There, in dim lamplight, they rubbed away the mask. Rouge smeared across linen, teeth bared in their true ruin, faces aching with fatigue. For a few moments they were themselves again, bare, flawed, vulnerable. But morning always came, and with it the jars, the brushes, the powder. Beauty was never a choice, it was a duty renewed daily. And so you watch the woman at the table, her lips crimson in the lamplight, her smile stiff but brilliant. She looks beautiful, yes, but the cost glimmers in the cracks, in the sore gums, the burning lips, the blackened teeth beneath. The brutality of Elizabethan beauty is written, not in the portraits that remain, but in the private pain behind every smile. And as you turn away from the oak table, you carry the echo of those painted mouths, knowing they spoke more of survival than of vanity. Picture a candlelit chamber again, but tonight the focus drifts not to faces or lips, but to the faint shimmer of blue traced delicately beneath pale white skin. You lean closer and realize those lines are not natural veins, but painted ones, thin strokes of blue pigment brushed across temples and down the neck. It seems strange, almost theatrical, but in Elizabethan England it was considered the very height of refinement. The court loved to see a woman appear fragile, transparent, as though her skin were so pure that the very blood flowing inside her could be glimpsed from without. In this strange ideal, the more ghost-like a woman appeared, the more noble she seemed. And so, night after night, women dipped brushes into pots of indigo or blue coal pigment, mapping out veins like tiny rivers across their faces. This obsession with veins came from an older tradition of linking pale skin to purity. A woman untouched by the sun was thought to be untouched by labour, closer to virtue, further from earthiness, but the Elizabethans, never subtle in their fashions, exaggerated it. It wasn't enough for skin to be white, it had to be transparent. Artists painted portraits in which ladies' veins stood out like fine embroidery beneath their skin. The paintings themselves then reinforced the habit. If the Queen's ladies were shown with faint blue streaks across their temples, then courtiers had to imitate them in life. The cycle was endless. Paint influenced portrait, and portrait demanded more paint. You can imagine the scene of preparation. After the lead, paste, and powder came the rouge, then the delicate step of vein painting. A maid with steady hands would take a tiny brush, dip it lightly in blue, and sketch faint lines along the temples. The lady would tilt her head, examining the result in her cloudy mirror, deciding whether the lines were visible enough under candlelight. Too faint, and the effect vanished. Too dark, and she looked like a doll cracked across the forehead. The balance was delicate, and the pressure immense. The cruelty here is subtle but sharp. It demanded that women not only hide their natural faces, but create illusions of fragility. A strong woman, one whose body could withstand work or illness, was not considered beautiful. Instead, beauty lay in weakness, in paleness, in looking perpetually one fainting spell away from collapse. To paint veins was to paint vulnerability. It meant presenting your body as delicate, consumable, almost breakable. And the irony was that women strong enough to endure the paints, the corsets, and the politics had to disguise themselves as frail creatures to be admired. Sometimes the blue was not pigment, but actual ink, pricked lightly into the skin to give the impression of natural veins. This painful method left faint stains that could last days. Imagine the sting of a needle tracing lines along your temples, just so others might think you delicate. And yet, some endured it, because beauty was never a private matter in the Elizabethan court. It was currency, reputation, even survival. One could joke that tattoo parlors today are less painful than the quiet inkings of the 16th century. Writers of the age remarked on this fashion, some admiring it, others mocking. One pamphleteer described women's painted veins as roads for gnats to wander, making fun of the absurdity, but ridicule never halted the trend. Much like our own age of beauty filters, the criticism existed alongside the obsession. Everyone could see the illusion, but no one dared step out of it. Better to be mocked for excess than pitied for natural skin, and this performance of fragility extended beyond paint. Women carried themselves as though faintness were proof of elegance. A carefully executed swoon, a hand placed dramatically against the temple, might win sympathy and admiration. Powder, rouge, and painted veins all contributed to this fragile image. The cruelty was psychological as much as physical. Women were trained to perform weakness as a virtue, to act the part of someone who needed protecting, even when they were strong enough to manage estates, households, and political intrigues. Consider the symbolism of veins themselves. They spoke of life's hidden pathways, blood flowing unseen. To reveal them was to hint at intimacy, but in a way that was acceptable, delicate, almost holy. There is something haunting in it. Women turn their own bodies into maps, painted rivers running across skin, just to be judged worthy. And those maps were judged daily, in halls where every glance was a verdict. Of course, this ideal clashed brutally with reality. The painted veins often ran alongside sores, caused by lead paste, or across skin reddened by irritation. A woman might appear angelic from across the hall, but closer inspection revealed the cracks, bruised flesh, peeling patches, lines smudged with sweat. Still, the performance mattered more than truth. Beauty standards are never about reality, only about sustaining an illusion others demand to see. It is tempting to laugh at the absurdity at ladies drawing blue rivers on their faces, but the laughter catches when you realize how familiar it feels. Our own culture prizes filters that erase pores, lenses that enlarge eyes, apps that bleach skin. The Elizabethan brush was simply the 16th century version of a digital filter, fragile and fleeting. The cruelty is the same, forcing women to erase themselves and replace their bodies with fantasies. And yet, there was something theatrical in it that cannot be ignored. In those great candlelit feasts, with music echoing through the rafters and courtiers parading in silks, the sight of so many ghost-pale faces, crimson lips, and faintly blue temples must have been astonishing. It was like stepping into a living painting, an illusion sustained by hundreds of bodies at once. To participate was to be part of the performance. To refuse was to disappear. Imagine the loneliness of being the only face without paint in that sea of masks. Some women tried gentler methods to mimic veins. A few used crushed violets or blueberries, natural dyes, less harsh than chemicals. The results were softer, less defined, but safer. Still, these alternatives marked one as less fashionable, less daring. Just as today a drugstore lipstick rarely carries the same prestige as a designer brand, so too did the humble berry mark its wearer as outside elite circles. Safety was rarely enough to outweigh status. The queen herself again set the tone. Elizabeth's portraits often show her with pale expanses of skin, veins faintly visible at the temples. Courtiers copied her without question, knowing that to mirror her image was to signal loyalty. The irony, of course, is that the Queen, powerful, commanding, ruthless, inspired a style that made women appear fragile. The contradiction is almost comic. The most formidable ruler of her age made fragility fashionable. Behind closed doors, however, women bore the cost. Vein painting required stillness, patience, and constant reapplication. One careless wipe of the brow could smear the effect. Dancing too vigorously, laughing too loudly, even leaning against a wall risked ruining hours of careful work. Women learned to move gently, to restrain their own bodies, because their very skin was a canvas always on display. It was not just beauty, it was a leash. And servants, as always, bore part of the burden. They mixed the pigments, sharpened brushes, reapplied smudges, and endured the sneezes that clouds of powder provoked. Imagine the irony of a maid working until her hands cracked, just so her mistress could appear incapable of labor. The performance of fragility relied on the hidden strength of others. Beauty was never solitary, it was collective suffering disguised as elegance. Some resisted quietly. Country women, less bound by courtly fashion, let their skin remain bare. They might laugh at tales of painted veins, calling them foolish, but even they felt the ripple. Gossip travelled, and comparisons were inevitable. A farmer's daughter who visited London might return self-conscious of her sun-browned cheeks. Suddenly aware of standards she had never before considered, beauty cruelty spreads like smoke, seeping into places it was never meant to go. The cruelty, ultimately, was not in the blue lines themselves, but in what they symbolized: a demand that women erase strength and embrace weakness, that they trade health for appearance, that they pretend transparency even when poisoned by paint. Every vein painted was a reminder that their bodies were not their own, but canvases for the ideals of others. And so, as the candlelight fades and the painted veins glimmer faintly one last time before sleep, you sense the true brutality. The faces of Elizabethan women were not only whitened and rouged, but dissected, traced, turned into living maps of frailty. They lived inside illusions demanded by men, rulers, and society alike, illusions that looked delicate, but cut deep. As you close your eyes, the blue rivers fade, but the cruelty they carried still flows quietly beneath history's surface. In the hush of an early morning chamber, where the shutters rattle faintly against the wind and the scent of tallow smoke lingers, you see a woman seated before her mirror. Tonight the focus shifts upward, not to cheeks or lips, but to her forehead. A maid approaches, comb in hand, and with careful fingers begins the task of pulling hair back. Higher and higher, the forehead must appear vast, unbroken, like the open sky. This was the Elizabethan obsession, a towering hairline, a brow stretched back until the face looked elongated, serene, almost inhuman. It sounds strange now, but to them it was beauty, and so women plucked, shaved, and scraped away their natural hairlines, sacrificing comfort for the sake of fashion. The practice was not subtle. Women literally tore out strands from their brows and temples, sometimes using tiny tweezers, sometimes sharp blades. The pain must have been sharp, but the reward was a forehead gleaming pale and smooth, like ivory. A high forehead symbolized intelligence, refinement, and nobility. It separated court ladies from peasants, whose hairlines remained low and unruly from outdoor labor. This was one of beauty's cruelties. To look refined, you had to inflict pain on yourself daily. Eyebrows suffered the same fate. Thinness was demanded, not the carefully shaped arches of modern salons, but almost complete erasure. Some women left only faint wisps, others none at all. The effect gave faces an eerie, mask-like quality, emphasizing the whitened skin and painted lips. A woman without brows looked both ethereal and unnatural, a living statue rather than a person. And yet, this was praised. The more inhuman one appeared, the closer one came to perfection. Imagine the rituals involved. A woman sits by her window in pale light, tweezers in hand, and plucks each hair slowly. Her eyes water, her skin reddens, but she perseveres. Perhaps she whispers to herself the same way we might at a waxing appointment today. It's worth it. It's worth it. The pain is dismissed as necessary. The discomfort as normal. That is the hidden brutality of beauty standards. Not only the harm they cause, but the way they make suffering feel inevitable. This pursuit of the elongated forehead had practical dangers. Constant plucking could lead to infections, sores, and scarring. Some women rubbed caustic substances like quicklime along their hairlines to thin the roots, literally burning the skin to halt growth. The scars left behind were hidden beneath paint and powder, but they remained. A forehead smooth in candlelight might, up close, be mottled with irritation and damage. Yet such flaws mattered less than conformity. The Queen herself enforced the standard by example. Elizabeth I, whose portraits reveal a high and gleaming brow, shaped the fashion of her court. Her ladies followed her lead, their own brows and hairlines receding year after year. It became a visible badge of loyalty, proof that they mirrored their sovereign in appearance, as well as in allegiance. Imagine the irony. The most powerful woman in England set a trend that demanded women appear stripped of strength and expression. Artists reinforced the obsession. Portraits of noble women exaggerate the forehead, smoothing the skin into an alabaster expanse. Painters erased stray hairs, sharpening the illusion of purity and intellect. Those portraits admired and copied created impossible standards. Women compared themselves not to reality, but to brushstrokes on canvas. In this, the Elizabethan world was no different from ours, except their airbrush was made of oils and pigments instead of Photoshop. There were quirks and absurdities too. Some women, having plucked their brows too thin, drew faint replacements with coal or soot. These smudges often slipped in sweat, leaving streaks down temples. Others applied ointments of vinegar and alum to slow regrowth, which sometimes left chemical burns. Picture the contradiction. Women injured themselves both to remove hair and to prevent it from daring to return. It was a war against their own bodies, waged daily with tweezers and pastes, and this standard cut across class lines in strange ways. Poorer women, unable to afford elaborate powders or rouges, still plucked their brows, chasing the high forehead look. Even in village markets, milkmaids might be seen with reddened brows, evidence of plucking. The cruelty spread outward, reaching even those who gained no advantage from it. For them the cost was not political survival, but social ridicule. A woman with natural brows might be mocked as rustic or uncouth. Beauty's whip spared no one. Consider how expression itself was stolen. Eyebrows are essential for showing emotion, surprise, anger, joy. Without them, faces looked blank, unreadable. Some husbands complained they could not tell their wives' moods. Others praised the serene stillness, as though emotion itself were ugly. Imagine being forced to erase not only hair but also the ability to show feeling, reduced to a marble mask while your true self simmered beneath. There was, inevitably, humour in the absurdity. Pamphleteers and satirists joked about women's foreheads stretched so high they touched the stars. One even claimed that plucked brows made women's eyes appear permanently astonished, as though the world shocked them at every turn. The mockery might sound light, but it carried cruelty, ridicule if you obeyed, ridicule if you did not. Either way, women lost. The cruelty was also generational. Mothers taught daughters to pluck, passing down tweezers alongside recipes for powders. Young girls, barely in their teens, learned early that pain was part of becoming a lady. Childhood was shortened, innocence plucked out hair by hair. To grow into womanhood was to inherit suffering dressed as beauty. The cycle spun on, unbroken, reinforced by family, as much as by court. Some resisted quietly. A few women kept their brows fuller, their hairlines lower, shrugging off whispers. But resistance came at a cost. A lady who refused the plucked look risked seeming outdated, unfashionable, or even disloyal to the queen's example. In a world where reputation determined survival, such risks were enormous. So most endured, hiding their frustration behind painted lips and smoothed brows. Medical texts occasionally warned against excessive plucking, noting infections and fevers that followed, but the warnings fell on deaf ears, drowned by the louder voice of fashion. As always, survival meant obedience. Better to fall ill in silence than to appear unkempt in public. One physician, exasperated, wrote that women value their brows less than the worms that gnaw them after death. Dark humour, but telling even doctors knew beauty, demanded sacrifices reason could not prevent. It is tempting to see only absurdity here, the elongated brows, the scraped foreheads, the soot-smeared lines. But beneath lies something deeper, a society that demanded women strip themselves of natural strength, to appear controlled, subdued, doll-like. Every hair removed was another inch of power surrendered. It was not merely about appearance, it was about teaching women that their natural bodies were unacceptable, needing correction at every turn. Think of the portraits again. Serene faces with vast white brows, thin lips red as coals, cheeks powdered pale. They look timeless, dignified, yet behind each portrait was pain, tweezers pinching, skin burning, tears wiped away quickly so paint would not smear. To admire those portraits today, without remembering the suffering they concealed, is to miss their truth. And yet, the women endured, even thrived within the cruelty. They laughed at satirical jokes, teased each other about uneven brows, found ways to turn suffering into shared experience. Perhaps that is the softest resistance of all, finding humour in pain, camaraderie in cruelty. It did not end the standard, but it gave women moments of relief, flickers of humanity beneath the mask. So, as you watch the woman before her mirror, her maid, plucking and shaving, her brows receding, her forehead stretching pale and bare, you see the full brutality of this beauty, not just the pain of hair torn out, but the theft of expression, the demand for weakness, the cycle of ridicule and obedience. And still she sits, enduring, because to stop is to vanish from her world. The high forehead gleams, the brows are erased, and beauty once again triumphs over the body it destroys. Picture a narrow street in London, its cobbles slick with rain, the smell of fish and horses mingling with smoke from chimneys. Down this street you hear the rasp of a saw, the thump of a mallet, the chatter of apprentices. Tonight the focus drifts not to powders or paints, but to hair, or rather the lack of it. Elizabethan beauty demanded not only smooth skin and painted lips, but also hair arranged into elaborate displays, often so grand they needed scaffolding of wire and pins. Yet for many women, hair itself was not enough. Wigs, perukes and false locks became the silent trade that defined appearances. Behind the shining curls you see in portraits lurked wig makers' workshops, cluttered, itchy and filled with the crawling reality of lice. Hair was a symbol of power as much as beauty. A noblewoman's locks might be powdered, curled, or braided into towering structures, decorated with jewels and ribbons, but the fashion was fickle, and natural hair rarely sufficed. Bald spots from lead poisoning, thinning from stress, or simply the desire for volume drove women to buy wigs. Wig makers scoured the markets for hair, often taken from the poor or even from corpses. It is a chilling thought. The noblewoman dancing at court may wear the hair of a beggar buried days before. Beauty did not just demand suffering, it demanded scavenging. The cruelty of wigs was physical as well. A peruca was heavy, often stiff with powder and glue. Imagine the weight of several pounds strapped to your head with pins biting into your scalp. After hours of wearing such burdens, women often developed sores, bald patches, or headaches that lasted into the night. Still, they endured, because a full head of shining hair was worth more in courtly currency than any comfort. Beauty was not soft, it pressed like iron. Wigs also carried the indignity of infestation. Lice thrived in the warm tangles of powdered curls, Servants were tasked with combing through the wigs, boiling them, or smoking them over fires to kill the vermin. The smell of singed hair must have filled those workshops, acrid and sour, yet wigs returned to heads, resettled like crowns, even as itching continued beneath. Imagine the quiet torment of scratching your scalp while trying to look serene during a banquet. If ever there was a definition of cruelty and beauty, it was this: elegance sustained by constant crawling discomfort. For men, wigs became a badge of dignity, but for women, they were necessity. Queen Elizabeth herself wore elaborate wigs, especially as age thinned her natural hair. These perukes were often dyed bright red to match her youthful image piled high with jewels. Her ladies followed, wearing smaller versions that still towered over their brows. To refuse was to mark oneself as disloyal, and so the wig-maker's trade thrived, a hidden industry supporting the grand illusion of courtly beauty. Consider the economic cruelty as well. A high-quality wig was costly, sometimes more than a year's wages for a servant. Families went into debt to buy them, believing their daughters' chances of marriage or favour depended on it. Poorer women made do with false locks, small bunches of hair tied to combs and clipped into their own. These often slipped embarrassingly during dances, tumbling onto the floor like rats. Laughter followed, but behind it lay desperation. A woman caught between ridicule and conformity. The maintenance was endless. Wigs had to be brushed daily, perfumed to mask smells, dusted with powder to gleam in candlelight. Each process introduced new hazards. Perfumes contained chemicals that irritated the scalp, powders lodged in lungs, brushes spread lice. To maintain beauty was to live in constant battle with vermin, illness, and expense. The polished curls seen in portraits were monuments built on hidden labour. Servants bore much of the burden. They untangled wigs for hours, enduring bites and stings as lice crawled onto their hands. They heated irons to curl locks, risking burns. They stitched and repaired wigs late into the night, often with failing eyesight from candlelight. Behind every noblewoman's shining hair stood at least one exhausted servant, unseen and unpaid properly for the suffering. Beauty, as always, was communal exploitation disguised as individual glamour. Some wigs were so elaborate they required metal frames to hold their shape. Women carried miniature scaffolds on their heads, wires digging into their scalps, just so curls could rise like architectural towers. The resemblance to castles was not lost on satirists, who joked that women carried fortresses in their heads. But the humour did not lessen the weight. Women endured literal pain to turn their hair into structures that impressed courtiers for a single evening. And wigs were not only ornaments, they hid disease. Syphilis, spreading widely in Elizabethan England, caused baldness. Wigs became a mask for shame, concealing illness behind curls. But gossip often pierced the disguise. If a woman wore wigs too often, whispers followed. "She is diseased," they muttered, as though the mask betrayed its own secret. Thus wigs protected and condemned at once. Another cruel paradox of beauty. Men, again, wore wigs as well, but their suffering was lighter. A man's peruke might be shorter, less decorated, more practical. He could remove it without scandal, even appear bold in certain company. Women, however, were expected to remain adorned at all times. A bare scalp on a woman was scandalous, an admission of weakness. So while men shrugged off discomfort, women lived beneath it daily, prisoners of powdered hair. Wig fashion also changed rapidly, forcing constant expense. One year favoured short curls, the next demanded long flowing locks. Families sold land to keep up, hoping their daughters might secure favour at court. In this way, beauty's cruelty was not only personal, but generational, draining fortunes into the hands of wig-makers, perfumers, and apothecaries. Appearance was not a choice, but an investment with survival at stake. Humour crept in, as it always does. Satirists wrote of wigs slipping during dances, of curls collapsing in rain, of lice leaping onto banquet tables. One story tells of a noblewoman bowing before the queen, only for her wig to tumble forward, revealing a bald pat. The court roared with laughter, but the woman's reputation never recovered. A simple accident ended her prospects. The cruelty was merciless, for beauty allowed no mistakes. And then there were the powders used on wigs, clouds of flour or starch, shaken until the hair gleamed white. These powders caught fire easily, making wigs literal tinder. Several reports tell of women leaning too close to candles and watching their wigs burst into flame. Imagine the terror of carrying such danger on your head, yet still returning the next night with freshly powdered curls. Beauty was not only cruel, it was combustible. Servants often joked quietly about their mistresses' wigs, calling them haystacks for vermin or helmets of vanity. Yet those same servants labored to maintain them, caught in the cycle of cruelty themselves. The entire household bore the cost of one woman's appearance, because her reputation affected the family's fortunes. Beauty was never private, it was a collective burden carried by all. Still, within the cruelty, women found small freedoms. A wig allowed experimentation, a blonde today, a redhead tomorrow, a cascade of curls one evening, a crown of braids the next. Beneath the suffering was also play, an ability to transform identity, to claim a moment of power in choice. Perhaps that is why wigs endured, despite the torment. They gave women fleeting control in a world that demanded so much obedience. Yet the shadow remained. Every itch, every burn, every whispered rumor of lice was a reminder that beauty exacted its tax. A noblewoman might smile serenely, her wig powdered and perfumed, but beneath her scalp itched, her head ached, her servant sighed. The portraits do not show this, of course. They show only serene curls gleaming in golden light, eternal lies captured in paint. And so, as you walk past the wig-maker's shop, hearing the scrape of combs and the hiss of boiling pots, you see beauty's cruelty written in hair itself. It is heavy, itchy, dangerous, and yet inescapable. For Elizabethan women, hair was never merely hair. It was a battlefield, a mask, a weight, a crown of suffering worn daily. They endured it as they endured powders and paints, because to appear otherwise was to risk vanishing. Picture a crowded hall on a summer evening, torches sputtering as heat presses against the walls. Beneath the layers of silks and brocades, the air is thick with human bodies, each one sweating in secret. Yet instead of the raw smell of flesh and labor, you catch sharp sweetness, heady florals, pungent musks. This is not the natural odor of the court, but a crafted disguise. Tonight we drift into the world of perfume, the scents designed not to delight but to conceal. Elizabethan England was not a place of daily baths. Water was mistrusted, believed to spread disease rather than cure it. People bathed perhaps once a month, sometimes less, and even then often with perfumed oils rather than soap and water. The result was simple: bodies smelled, and perfume became not luxury but armor. Imagine the layers of odor clinging to one hall. Beneath velvet sleeves, sweat dampens linen shifts. Beneath powder, skin festers with lead sores. Beneath wigs, lice thrive. Add to this the stench of chamber pots, emptied too rarely, and of candles made from tallow fat, smoking acrid into the air. Now lay over it all rosewater, musk, ambergris, civet, animalistic scents pressed into oils and rubbed onto necks, wrists, clothing. The effect was overwhelming. To walk into a feast was to walk into a storm of smells, none quite natural, all battling for dominance. Perfume did not refine, it suffocated. Ambergris was prized above all, a waxy substance from the guts of whales, washed ashore after months at sea. Its scent was musky, earthy, strangely alluring. To dab ambergris on one's skin was to declare wealth and taste, but to others the smell hinted faintly of rot. Civet, another popular base, came from the anal glands of civet cats, scraped into jars and traded at high prices. Imagine rubbing that behind your ears just to smell desirable. The irony is sharp. To mask the stench of sweat, Elizabethan nobles willingly smeared themselves with the musk of animals' hindquarters. Perfume was more than fashion. It was believed to protect against plague. Doctors argued that foul air spread disease, so sweet or strong scents might ward it off. Women carried pomanders, little balls of scented herbs and spices, tied to their belts. Some contained cloves, rosemary, lavender, even vinegar-soaked sponges. To pass through a crowded street without such a talisman was unthinkable. Beauty and survival were fused. The scent that made you appealing also promised to keep death at bay. Whether it worked or not hardly mattered. Belief itself was the comfort. Servants were tasked with constant refreshment of scents. They sprinkled rosewater on linen, washed floors with lavender oil, and sewed dried herbs into bodices. In the royal palaces, entire chambers were fumigated with burning incense before great events. Yet the sweetness rarely lasted. Underneath, the human stench returned, stronger for having been momentarily concealed. You might call it the Elizabethan equivalent of spraying deodorant over unwashed gym clothes. It fooled no one for long, and perfumes themselves could be dangerous. Oils thick with animal fats clogged pores already suffocated by lead paste. Some caused rashes or swelling. Civet oil in particular irritated the skin, burning faintly as it sat beneath collars. Yet women endured it, because to smell offensive was to risk humiliation. A lady might be praised for her gown, her lips, her dance, but one whisper about foul odour could undo her reputation in a night. Humour naturally followed. Satirists wrote plays, mocking ladies who reeked like perfumed stables, suggesting their scents were too strong. One popular jest was that a woman smelled so sweet you could taste her 3 rooms away, but behind the joke lay cruelty. Women had no escape. Smell too strong, mocked for excess. Smell too weak, shamed for neglect. Every scent was judged, every body a battleground. Perfume also served as class marker. The wealthy afforded costly imports, ambergris, musk, myrrh, while the poor made do with rosemary water or vinegar, steeped with herbs. A noblewoman's scent announced her wealth before she even entered the room, but it also revealed her anxieties. The more perfume she wore, the more she feared being judged. The irony is that the poorest often smelled cleaner. Labourers bathed in rivers out of necessity, while nobles avoided water out of superstition. Beauty's brutality was that women ruined themselves with luxuries, while peasants endured with simplicity. Queen Elizabeth herself was said to favour rosewater, and her laundresses boiled vats of it daily to wash her linen. Her presence carried sweetness, but also a reminder of labour unseen. Fields of roses plucked, servants bent over boiling pots, endless expense poured into maintaining a single woman's scent. Every whiff of perfume carried hidden suffering, far from the candlelit chambers where it was admired. The cruelty was also psychological. Perfume was not worn for oneself, but for others. A woman might never know how she truly smelled beneath the layers, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. Did her neighbour wrinkle his nose? Did her rival whisper about a sour undertone? Self-doubt lingered like a second scent, invisible but ever-present. In a world without showers, the body itself was suspect, something to be disguised, never trusted. Perfume clung to clothing, to wigs, to gloves. Some nobles wore perfumed gloves soaked in ambergris, the scent rising with every gesture. Imagine offering a hand to dance and carrying with it just a touch, but a wave of musk. Others perfumed letters, sealing them with scents meant to seduce or flatter. Love itself became entangled with smell, a romance of oils rather than of truth. And always, beneath, the human body waited, raw and unadorned, unfit for court. There were absurdities too. Some recipes advised soaking sponges in wine, pressing them into bodices to release sweetness during dances. Others recommended rubbing rabbit fat into the skin before applying perfume so the scent would linger longer. One bizarre concoction even included crushed pearls mixed with rose oil, a waste of treasure, but proof of devotion to appearance. Each absurdity was another reminder. Beauty demanded not reason, but obedience. Perfume also masked disease poorly. Bad breath from rotting teeth could not be erased with clove oil, though many tried. Sweaty sores beneath corsets festered no matter how much rose water was dabbed on top. The cruelty was in the pretense that one could cover sickness with sweetness, convincing others, and perhaps oneself, that rot did not exist. To smell of roses while dying of lead poisoning was the strangest theatre of all. Men, as ever, bore less burden. A gentleman might dab a little musk, but he was praised for smelling of leather or horses, natural odours of masculinity. Women, by contrast, were expected to erase themselves entirely. Sweat, breath, flesh, all hidden beneath borrowed scents. Their very existence was considered offensive unless disguised. That is the essence of beauty's cruelty, to teach women that their natural bodies were unacceptable from birth. And yet, perfume was not only prison. For some women it became a tool of power. A carefully chosen scent could seduce, distract, or command. A lady who entered a hall trailing exotic musk might capture all ears before speaking a word. In this way, women wielded perfume as weapon, crafting identity in a world that stripped it away. The cruelty remained, but within it flickered agency, a small fire burning beneath layers of rosewater. But perfumes could also betray. Too strong a musk revealed attempts at seduction, sparking scandal. Too faint a rosewater hinted at poverty. Women walked a razor edge, judged not by words or deeds, but by smells that shifted with every hour. Imagine the exhaustion of living not only in fear of mirrors, but in fear of noses around you. The cruelty was not only chemical, it was constant surveillance. At the end of the night, perfumes lingered on sheets, mixing with sweat and smoke. A chamber might reek of musk for days after a single banquet. Servants opened shutters, burned herbs, tried to banish the heaviness. Yet scents clung stubbornly, as if mocking the attempt to erase them. Beauty left residue, impossible to wash away. Even now, centuries later, descriptions of Elizabethan halls mention their overpowering stench beneath all the perfume. History itself cannot scrub clean the odour of vanity. So you stand in that hall, overwhelmed by sweetness and rot. Around you swirl women in gowns stiff with jewels, their faces painted, their wigs powdered, their bodies perfumed until nothing human remains. They look beautiful in candlelight, yes, but the truth is harsher. Beneath the roses lies rot, beneath the musk lies sweat, beneath the civet lies cruelty. Perfume did not erase the human body, it only taught women to despise it. And that perhaps was the most brutal scent of all. Picture the echo of footsteps in a stone chamber, the air heavy with the smell of damp stone, hot wax, and human breath. Torches spit against the walls while musicians tune their lutes in the gallery above. Below, a crowd of noble women gathers, each one bound inside her gown by cords drawn so tightly that their ribs strain with every shallow breath. Tonight we step into the world of corsets, or stays as the Elizabethans called them, those stiffened garments that clamped the torso into narrow lines and sculpted the body into what fashion demanded. You can almost hear the creak of whalebone, the sighs of women trying not to faint, and the snap of laces pulled by the unrelenting hands of servants. Corsetry was not new in Elizabethan England, but it became more elaborate, more demanding. Stays were made of heavy linen stiffened with glue, stuffed with reeds, or reinforced with whalebone and wood. Iron busks sometimes slid down the front, keeping the torso rigid. The purpose was clear: to flatten the chest, lengthen the waist, and push the body into a conical shape. The silhouette this created made gowns appear grand, skirts flare wider, and necks rise higher. But the price was steep. Breathing grew shallow, digestion faltered, ribs bruised. Beauty became a cage, literally built into clothing. Imagine the ritual of dressing. A noble woman stands, arms braced against the bedpost, while her maid winds cords around her. With each pull, the air grows tighter. The woman gasps but nods to continue, because a loose corset means ridicule at court. She feels her ribs compress, her stomach forced upward, her spine held unnaturally straight. By the time the laces are tied, she can barely draw breath, yet she smiles into the mirror, because the shape reflected there is what the world demands. The cruelty here is not hidden. It is wrapped around her body like a second skin. Doctors of the time sometimes warned against tight lacing, claiming it displaced organs, caused fainting, and even harmed unborn children. And yet, the warnings were ignored, just as women today ignore health cautions about high heels or extreme dieting. The social penalty for refusing was greater than the physical risk of compliance. A woman fainting at a banquet might be admired for her delicate constitution. A woman appearing too loose in her stays risked whispers of vulgarity. Even pain was twisted into proof of refinement. Corsets also revealed class. The stiffest, most elaborate stays required costly materials, whalebone imported from northern seas, iron forged carefully, fine linen woven tightly. Poorer women wore looser bodices, or none at all, their bodies left freer but also marked as common. In this way, the cruelty of fashion not only constrained women's lungs, but also reinforced the hierarchy of wealth. The tighter your corset, the higher your status, even if it meant you collapsed in the middle of a dance. The irony was that corsets claimed to protect posture. Manuals suggested that stays kept young girls upright, preventing slouching. Mothers bound their daughters early, believing it taught discipline. But in truth, corsets forced the body into shapes it resisted, creating weakness rather than strength. Muscles atrophied from lack of use, spines bent unnaturally, and ribs grew deformed. Imagine a generation of women taught that their bodies must be trained like disobedient animals, punished into submission by fabric and bone. Servants again bore the hidden labor. They laced their mistresses each morning, their fingers bruised from pulling cords tight. They endured scolding if the fit was uneven or the shape imperfect. Some maids confessed to secretly loosening laces for kind-hearted mistresses, giving them a little more air during long days. Others boasted of pulling tighter, proud of the elegance they could create. In either case, beauty was measured by the strain of another woman's hands. The effects during feasts were dramatic. Women sat stiffly, barely able to lean forward for a bite of food. They learned to take tiny morsels, chewing slowly so as not to choke with compressed lungs. Drinking too much wine was dangerous. The stomach, pressed upward, rejected excess. And yet the performance continued. To eat heartily was unfashionable. To eat delicately, slowly, was praised. Thus corsets enforced not only shape but behavior, dictating even the pace of a woman's appetite. Fainting became a spectacle of its own. Overheated in crowded halls, laced too tightly, many women collapsed. Servants rushed forward, carrying them to side chambers where stays could be loosened. Strangely, fainting did not harm reputations. It enhanced them. A fainting lady was delicate, sensitive, refined. Her collapse became theatre, proof that she was too ethereal for the roughness of life. Imagine the cruelty of applauding women for losing consciousness, as though weakness itself were the pinnacle of beauty. And corsets did not exist alone. They worked with farthingales, wide hoops that expanded skirts into domes, and with stiff ruffs around the neck. Together, these garments imprisoned the body almost entirely, turning women into moving sculptures. To sit, stand, or walk required calculation. To bend was impossible. A woman dressed fully for court lived inside architecture, not clothing. She became a building of fabric, bones, and iron, admired for grandeur, but stripped of freedom. Some men mocked the extremes, joking that women looked like barrels bound in hoops. Satirical drawings showed figures so stiff they could not fit through doorways. Yet behind the mockery lay complicity. Men demanded these fashions while laughing at them, forcing women into cages, and then ridiculing their captivity. Humor became another layer of cruelty, turning women's suffering into entertainment. Of course, not all women submitted equally. Country ladies and poorer townsfolk wore looser stays or none at all, valuing mobility over elegance. Yet even they felt pressure to imitate the look on feast days or in portraits. A farmer's wife might borrow stays for a wedding, enduring the squeeze for one day of appearances. Beauty's cruelty trickled down, touching even those who lived far from courtly halls. There were oddities too. Some believed corsets could heal deformities, straighten crooked backs, or protect against illness. Mothers bound children tightly, hoping to mold their bodies into perfection. These practices often harmed rather than helped, leaving permanent damage. But superstition wrapped itself around fashion, justifying cruelty as care. It is a reminder that beauty often disguises harm beneath the language of health. And yet, within the suffering, women found ways to adapt. Some padded their stays for comfort, or loosened them slightly in private chambers. Others decorated busks with carvings or embroidery, turning instruments of pain into emphases of art. A lover might gift a carved busk with initials or symbols, hidden against the woman's skin. In this strange way, cruelty became intimacy, as though saying, "I know your cage, and I mark it with affection." The Queen herself set the sharpest example. Elizabeth wore stays that flattened her chest and elongated her figure, making her appear statuesque. Her image, painted endlessly, reinforced the fashion until it became law. No courtier dared appear without the rigid silhouette, for to do so was to reject the Queen's model. Thus one woman's armour became every woman's burden, and the cycle of corsetry deepened. By night, women bore the consequences: bruised ribs, aching backs, shallow breaths that left them restless in sleep. Some removed their stays with sighs of relief, the body expanding painfully into its natural shape. Others wore looser versions even in bed, believing constant pressure necessary to maintain their figure. There was no escape, only shifting degrees of confinement. Beauty's cruelty did not end when the candles were snuffed. And yet, like wigs, corsets offered fleeting power. They could create illusions, a slim waist, a towering presence that commanded attention. Some women revelled in the transformation, using their sculpted bodies to captive, to distract, to control. In this way, corsets were double-edged, tools of oppression, but also weapons of influence. The paradox is almost unbearable. Women hurt themselves to gain power in a world that left them few other choices. So you linger in that hall, hearing music swell while women sit stiffly, lips painted, brows plucked, stays crushing their ribs. They smile, they dance, they faint, they rise again. Beauty demands not comfort, but sacrifice, not health, but performance. And still they endure, because to refuse is to vanish. The creak of whalebone echoes louder than the lutes, a chorus of suffering disguised as elegance. The firelight dances across silk as you enter a great hall, the air close with warmth and the rustle of brocade. Tonight the focus shifts from faces and hair to the clothing itself, for Elizabethan gowns were not simply garments. They were armour of status, stitched with splendour yet lined with quiet brutality. Picture a noble woman stepping into her gown, the fabric heavy as stone, the seams stiff with embroidery, the edges biting her flesh. At first glance she glimmers like a jewel, but beneath her body bears the bruises of beauty. Clothing was not gentle in this age. It was demanding, restrictive, and often painful. To dress richly was to suffer richly. Silks were the most prized, shimmering in candlelight with colours deep and rare. Crimson, indigo, emerald, gold. These fabrics declared wealth, for only the wealthy could import them. Yet silk had a sharp side, woven tightly and stiffened with wire or whalebone, gowns cut into the skin, sleeves pressed against arms until they ached, bodices scraped shoulders raw. Imagine the weight of 10 or more pounds of cloth dragging at your every step, pulling at seams, rubbing blisters into your waist and thighs. By the end of a banquet, the noble woman's body bore marks no portrait ever showed. Farthingales made the suffering worse. These wide-hooped skirts, stiff with whalebone or cane, spread fabric into domes that filled entire doorways. The effect was grand, yes, but the weight immense. Women struggled to sit, needing stools without backs. Rising required servants to lift and guide the skirts like sails. In narrow passages, farthingales jammed, trapping women until others cleared the way. Satirists compared them to bell towers or overturned ships, and not without reason, yet every court demanded them, and women bore the indignity of being laughed at while forced to wear them. The cruelty extended even to movement. Long trains dragged across floors catching dust, ashes and chamber filth. Servants carried the hems, their arms straining under yards of silk. When women attempted to walk alone, their gowns tangled around their ankles, threatening falls. Dancing was an ordeal of calculation. Skirts swayed too wide, farthingales knocked into neighbours, sleeves caught on lutes or torches. But failure to move gracefully meant humiliation, so women rehearsed endlessly, turning agony into art. And still, clothing spoke louder than words. A woman in dull wool was invisible at court, no matter her wit. A woman in silk embroidered with pearls commanded attention, no matter her pain. Clothing became language, one that demanded constant investment. Families sold estates to afford gowns for daughters. A single dress might cost more than a farmer's yearly earnings, yet the dress was worn only a few times before fashion shifted. The cruelty here was economic as much as physical. Beauty consumed fortunes as readily as it consumed bodies. Even colours carried rules. Crimson, purple, and deep blue were restricted by sumptuary laws reserved for nobility. To wear them without rank was a punishable offence. Thus women not only bruised under gowns, but risked punishment if they erred in choice. Imagine standing before a mirror, not only adjusting lace, but also calculating legality. Knowing one wrong shade might ruin your family's honour. Beauty was policed by law, its cruelty sharpened into edict. Undergarments added their own torments. Stiffened collars rubbed the neck until skin broke, leaving sores hidden by ruffs. Tight hose restricted circulation, making legs ache during long hours of standing. Even gloves, perfumed and stiff, blistered hands that wore them too long. Every part of the body was bound, pressed or pricked by beauty. To appear effortless was to carry constant pain. And let us not forget jewellery. Heavy necklaces dragged at the neck, earrings stretched lobes until they tore, rings pinched swollen fingers, crowns and coronets pressed into scalps already sore from wigs. Yet women smiled, knowing that without jewels, their gowns looked incomplete. The sparkle of gems distracted from fatigue, from sores, from hunger beneath stays. Jewelry was decoration and deception, covering suffering with brilliance. Satirists mocked the absurdity. Pamphlets described women as walking wardrobes, so stiff with fabric they might topple if nudged. One play joked about farthingales being wide enough to hide lovers beneath them, a cruel jest that turned discomfort into scandal. The mockery added insult to injury. Women were forced into painful garments, then ridiculed for wearing them. There was no winning, only enduring. And yet, clothing offered moments of power. A dazzling gown could silence rivals, capture eyes, win influence. A woman might endure bruises, but emerge triumphant if her appearance commanded respect. The paradox was cruel. Garments that harmed also offered the only armor women could wield in politics. Silk was not just fabric, it was a weapon in the war of reputation. Servants again carried much of the burden. They laced bodices, held farthingales, brushed dirt from hems. They bore the stink of gowns steeped in sweat and perfume, washed linens stiff with blood from sores. Their labour maintained illusions, while their own bodies remained unadorned, unvalued. Beauty was never solitary suffering. It rippled through every rung of the household. And the poor mimicked what they could. Milkmaids stitched rough skirts to puff like farthingales, or stuffed bodices with straw for shape. Their versions were clumsy, often ridiculed, but they revealed longing. Even those who gained no advantage from fashion craved its protection. The cruelty spread downward, infecting women across class lines with hunger for garments they could never truly afford. There were practical dangers too. Heavy skirts caught fire from hearths and candles. Stories abound of women whose farthingales ignited, flames racing faster than servants could smother. One noblewoman died after her skirts trapped her in a narrow passage, burning her alive. Beauty, quite literally, became deadly. And yet the fashion continued, for to abandon it meant vanishing from the court's theatre. At night, women removed their gowns with groans of relief. Skin bore red grooves from laces, shoulders ached from weight, feet blistered from shoes too narrow. Yet by morning the ritual began again. Layer after layer, stitch after stitch, each garment another piece of armor that bruised its wearer. To be admired was to be wounded daily. The Queen herself embodied this paradox. Elizabeth appeared in gowns stiff with jewels, collars so high she could barely turn her head. Her image was iconic, but behind it was exhaustion, servants dressing her for hours, her body confined in splendor. Her choices dictated every woman's fate. If she wore wide farthingales, her ladies must follow. If she chose towering collars, others copied. One woman's armor became an entire gender's burden. Still, women found small rebellions. Some stitched hidden pockets into gowns, defying rules of movement. Others loosened stays in private, or wore simpler shifts beneath finery. These tiny acts did not dismantle cruelty, but they reclaimed slivers of comfort, moments of humanity. To resist in small ways was to whisper, "My body is still mine," even when wrapped in silk cages. Looking at Elizabethan portraits today, you see splendor, silks shimmering, pearls gleaming, collars rising like thrones. But the paintings lie. They hide sweat, bruises, sores, and exhaustion. They conceal the groans of women squeezed by stays, the servants straining to lift skirts, the coins drained to buy jewels. Beauty in these portraits is serene, eternal, but serenity was built on suffering. To see only splendor is to miss the cruelty stitched into every seam. And so, as you stand in that hall, watching women move slowly under the weight of their gowns, you hear the quiet truth. The rustle of silk is not gentle, but a whisper of pain. Beauty was heavy, sharp, dangerous. It bruised bodies, drained fortunes, burned lives, yet still it glittered, because to stop glittering was to disappear. That is the paradox, and the cruelty of Elizabethan clothing. Splendor demanded scars. The hall quiets, the fiddles stilled, and yet beneath the hush there is another kind of noise, the rustle of whispers, the weight of glances, the calculations that never pause. Tonight the focus turns not to the powders or corsets, but to the marriage market, where beauty was currency and women were commodities traded with the same precision as silk or spices. You picture yourself standing in a candlelit gallery, tapestries muffling the walls, portraits of long-dead nobles watching as young women parade past, each face powdered, each gown stiff with jewels, each body sculpted into the silhouette of the age. Yet beneath the display there is fear. Who will be chosen? Who will be overlooked? Whose beauty will secure alliance? And whose will doom her family to debt or obscurity? Elizabethan England did not veil its economy of marriage. Wealth, land, and reputation flowed through women's bodies. A daughter's beauty might win her family a wealthy husband, lifting fortunes overnight. A daughter deemed plain risked being left unmarried, a financial burden. Imagine the pressure in every plucked hair, every painted vein, not only your own future at stake, but the prosperity of your kin. To falter in beauty was to falter in duty. The cruelty was not just personal but generational. This cruelty was sharpened by the court's merciless standards. A girl of 14 might be dressed in full silks, painted white and red, her brows plucked until her face looked unnaturally mature. Suitors would appraise her like a horse at market, teeth checked, skin inspected, family pedigree reviewed. Her worth was not her laughter, her intelligence, or her kindness, but the harmony of her features and the whiteness of her hands. Fair was not a compliment, it was currency, and if she failed to meet the standard, her marriage prospects dwindled to poorer men, lesser lands, and diminished futures. Families pushed daughters relentlessly into the mold. Mothers oversaw beauty regimens with iron will, teaching girls how to paint their faces, how to faint gracefully in corsets, how to walk with the sweeping skirts of farthingales. Fathers invested in gowns, wigs, and perfumes, viewing them not as indulgence but as necessary advertising. A daughter poorly dressed reflected shame on the family. A daughter too extravagant risked whispers of vanity. Between ridicule and expectation, the girl was trapped, a living advertisement of her household's ambitions, and the queen herself loomed over every match. Elizabeth never married, yet her court revolved around the marriages of others. A noblewoman's face was not only judged by suitors, but also by the queen's own favour. To outshine her risked wrath. To appear dull risked invisibility. Women walked a narrow path, their beauty both weapon and liability. Imagine the double fear: to please the queen but not threaten her, to attract a husband but not too quickly, to appear youthful but not foolish. Every detail mattered, every choice a gamble, dowries intertwined with appearance. A plain daughter might demand a heavier dowry, draining the family's wealth. A celebrated beauty might fetch a match, even without vast sums, her face serving as fortune. Thus beauty was literally money in flesh. Suitors wrote letters, praising women's ivory brows or ruby lips, as if they were coin weights, calculating value. Behind the poetry lay transactions as cold as any merchant's tally book. The cruelty was that women were both admired and commodified, exalted as goddesses while sold like goods. Even when marriages were secured, beauty remained a burden. A wife who lost her looks too quickly risked her husband's disdain, his wandering eye, his mockery. Women knew their youth and beauty were temporary, their power decaying with time. They clung to paints and perfumes not only for courtly splendor, but for the security of their marriages. Imagine living with the knowledge that your worth could fade with a wrinkle. The cruelty was constant. Beauty won you a husband, then beauty was demanded daily to keep him. Court gossip sharpened every insecurity. Whispers about a woman's pallor, her rotting teeth, or her sagging figure could ruin negotiations overnight. A rumor of illness, even imagined, might drive suitors away. Women lived under scrutiny, as relentless as any modern celebrity, except they had no escape. To disappear was not to retreat into privacy, but to risk permanent obscurity, even poverty. Satirists mocked the marriage market with cruel humour. Plays depicted fathers desperate to pawn off ugly daughters, mothers bribing suitors with false promises, maidens fainting dramatically to appear delicate. The laughter in theatres hid the pain in real chambers, where girls were forced to play the same games in earnest. Humour became another weapon, ridiculing the very women trapped in systems they did not design. Some women resisted, finding ways to bend the system. A clever courtier might cultivate wit, dazzling with conversation as well as looks. Another might use rumour to sabotage rivals, making her own plainness seem virtuous. But even these rebellions existed inside the cage. No matter how intelligent, a woman's first evaluation was always her face, her body, her conformity to fashion. The cruel truth: you could not opt out, only maneuver within. And the poor suffered echoes of the same system. Village girls might be judged less formally, but beauty still mattered in securing husbands. A girl too scarred by labour, too browned by sun, might be passed over for another. Families still sighed over plain daughters, still celebrated pretty ones as fortunes in flesh. Beauty's cruelty was universal, touching castle halls and village greens alike. Consider the weight of time. A girl knew her peak market, years were few. By 25, whispers of being on the shelf began. By 30, she was almost invisible in courtly calculations. This urgency drove families to rush marriages, painting their daughters earlier, thrusting them into the market while still young. Childhood collapsed beneath rouge and corsets. youth shortened by the ticking clock of desirability. The cruelty was not only the demand for beauty, but its expiration date. The queen's unmarried status twisted the system further. Some courtiers angled to keep daughters available, dreaming Elizabeth might one day relent and marry. Others feared 2 successful matches might draw the queen's jealousy. Thus beauty was not only personal, but political, entangled in national strategy. A daughter's face could make or break alliances, not just for her family but for England itself. Imagine the pressure of carrying an empire on your painted cheeks, and yet, beneath the cruelty, women found slivers of power. A celebrated beauty could influence suitors, play families against each other, even sway the queen's favour. For a brief time, beauty gave leverage, and all that denied women other tools. The tragedy was that the power was fleeting, its price always higher than its gain. Letters from the era reveal both longing and despair. Young men wrote sonnets praising milk-white hands and coral lips, reducing women to features. Women wrote back cautiously, aware that every word might seal or shatter prospect. One letter laments, "If I had but a fairer brow, my father's debts would be ease." Imagine the grief of knowing your family's survival depends on your skin, not your soul. And so the gallery remains in your mind. Rows of daughters on display, their faces painted, their bodies bound, their futures balanced on glances. Fathers whisper sums, mothers adjust ruffs, suitors circle like hawks. Beauty is the coin, marriage the market, and women the unwilling merchants. It is theatre and transaction, splendor and cruelty, hope and despair bound together. At the end of the night, when candles gutter and corridors empty, the daughters return to chambers. They remove gowns heavy with jewels, rub paint from weary faces, and stare into mirrors clouded with smoke. They wonder, was I admired? Was I enough? Did I bring my family closer to fortune or further into shame? The silence of those chambers is heavier than any gown, for it carries the weight of futures decided not by love, not by choice, but by beauty's brutal laws. The candles in the palace flicker against tapestries stiff with gold thread, and in their glow one figure dominates all others, Elizabeth herself. Tonight the gaze shifts to the Queen's shadow, the way her presence shaped not only politics but beauty itself. Elizabeth did not just rule England, she ruled its mirrors. Every woman in her court, from Duchess to Maid of Honour, lived in her reflection. To copy her was to declare loyalty, to differ was to risk suspicion. And yet, the image they were forced to imitate was itself an artifice, a mask of paints, wigs, and silks carefully constructed to conceal age and fragility. Imagine the irony. The most powerful woman in Europe demanded that every woman around her wear the very shackles she wore herself. Elizabeth's face was legend. Portraits showed her with alabaster skin, carmine lips, and a brow smoothed into ageless serenity. In reality, her natural hair thinned, her teeth blackened, her skin scarred from childhood smallpox. Yet her image was relentlessly maintained. Courtiers praised her beauty as eternal, even when age lined her face. This was not just flattery, it was survival. To speak truth was treason, and so illusion became reality. Every woman at court copied the illusion, painting their faces white with ceruse, reddening lips, plucking brows. The Queen's mask became every woman's burden. The cruelty lay in its impossibility. Elizabeth demanded a beauty she herself could not maintain without poisons and wigs. To imitate her meant to suffer the same harms. Lead soaking into skin, mercury staining mouths, corsets bruising ribs. Women obeyed, because to refuse meant exile from favour. Imagine being forced to copy an illusion that was killing its creator. Beauty became contagion, spreading outward from the Queen like fire. Her wig set the fashion for hair. Bright red, piled high, adorned with jewels. They gave her presence even as her real hair thinned. Courtiers scrambled to match the style, dyeing wigs to echo her shade. A woman with darker hair might dust it with powder until it gleamed faintly auburn, pretending closeness to the Queen's hue. The result was a court of redheads, some natural, most artificial, all desperate to mirror the monarch's crown. Here cruelty was not in the wig alone, but in the surrender of individuality. To be noticed was to disappear into the queen's reflection. Elizabeth collars were another commandment. The ruffs that rose like walls around her neck became symbols of majesty. Courtiers followed, strapping stiff linen and wire round their throats until heads could barely turn. These collars scraped skin raw, pressed against jaws made eating and speaking difficult. Yet women endured, for without ruffs they seemed unfinished, disloyal. A court lady might whisper that her neck bled beneath lace, but she smiled anyway because Elizabeth smiled. Beauty was not choice but decree. Portraiture reinforced the tyranny. Painters presented Elizabeth as eternal youth, her face unchanging across decades. She appeared as virgin, as goddess, as fairy queen, every image more fantastical than the last. Courtiers saw these portraits and knew they must follow. If the queen defied age, then they must too. Wrinkles became treason, grey hair an insult, freckles a danger. Imagine living in a hall where even the passage of time was forbidden on your skin. The queen's unmarried state sharpened the cruelty. She styled herself as the Virgin Queen, eternally desirable yet untouchable. Women at court were expected to echo her, alluring but not promiscuous, painted but not wanton. Every choice of rouge, of gown, of glance was measured against the queen's own balance. A woman too bold risked the queen's jealousy, too plain, and she vanished. Beauty became a narrow corridor with Elizabeth standing at its end, watching. Even scents followed her lead. Elizabeth adored rosewater. Vats were boiled daily for her laundry and chambers. Her courtiers copied, perfuming themselves until the palace reeked of roses layered over sweat and powder. A woman smelling of anything else risked seeming unfashionable, even rebellious. Imagine being bound not only in dress and paint, but in fragrance, your very smell commanded by another. The queen's shadow extended to the nose, and yet there was admiration in the cruelty. Many women loved Elizabeth fiercely, proud to mimic her, proud to wear the armor she created. To them, her beauty was not simply illusion, but symbol of England's strength, of a woman ruling in a world of kings. They suffered gladly, believing their painted faces part of the queen's triumph. The paradox is painful, oppression wrapped in loyalty, suffering masked as patriotism. But not all women celebrated. Some chafed under the demand, longing for simpler gowns, freer hair, less paint. They whispered complaints in private, joked about the queen's mask, and sighed as they scrubbed powder from their faces at night. Yet none dared defy openly. To strip the mask was to strip allegiance. Even discontent had to remain painted. Satirists dared more. They mocked courtiers who copied the queen too eagerly, describing halls of women who looked identical, like dolls lined in rows. One jest claimed a man could not tell his wife from his mistress at hat, since both wore the same wig and paint. The humour was cruel, but it revealed truth. Individuality had drowned in Elizabeth's shadow. Women became copies, their own beauty erased beneath imitation. The queen herself was not blind to the suffering she demanded. Letters show her scolding courtiers who appeared too gaudy, even while she insisted they dress magnificently. She mocked women who grew fat in farthingales, yet forced them to wear them. It was a strange cruelty, both conscious and unconscious, as though she both enforced and despised the system she created. Power blinded her to empathy, and women paid the price. Men, as always, bore lighter burdens. They wore ruffs, yes, but looser. They powdered hair, yes, but sparingly. Their worth was measured in land and loyalty, not lips and brows. They could age without exile. Women alone were bound to the queen's illusion, their bodies policed by her mirror. The injustice was glaring, yet invisible inside the golden glow of her reign. And still, the portraits remain. We look at them now and see majesty. Elizabeth resplendent in pearls, her ladies glowing behind her. But if you look longer, you sense the hidden pain, the ribs pressed by stays, the brows plucked to nothing, the lips burning with vermilion, the wigs itching with lice. Splendor hides scars. To study those portraits without remembering the suffering is to miss half their story. Some women found quiet rebellion in exaggeration. They painted, even whiter than the queen, wore ruffs wider, jewels heavier. By parodying the extremes, they mocked while pretending loyalty. These performances were dangerous, but they carved small spaces of freedom. A woman could laugh behind her fan, knowing she obeyed while secretly defying. Even in cruelty, there are cracks where resistance breathes. The queen's shadow also stretched beyond her lifetime. Long after her death, portraits of her remain the standard of beauty. Generations of women suffered in imitation of a woman who no longer lived, her mask becoming ghost. That is perhaps the most haunting cruelty. Beauty that kills its bearer still demands obedience from the living. Elizabeth's face outlasted Elizabeth, and women paid for her splendor long after she was gone. And so you picture the court once more, a hall of women, each face painted, each body bound, each smile strained, all reflecting the queen's image. They move like mirrors, catching candlelight but hiding themselves. Their beauty is not their own but hers. Borrowed and commanded, the queen shines, and in her shadow others dim. At the end of the night, the queen retires to her chamber. Servants peel away wigs, scrape lead from her skin, unlace stays. She sighs with exhaustion, yet tomorrow the mask will be rebuilt. Her courtiers do the same, each woman stripping her own disguise, each wondering where her face has gone. The cruelty of Elizabethan beauty lies not only in poison and corsets, but in this, that women were forced to become shadows of one woman, their own light dimmed by a crown. The night deepens, and with it comes a quieter cruelty, not the weight of silk or the sting of tweezers, but the invisible pressure of eyes and tongues. Tonight we step into the world of gossip, of whispers in corridors, of reputations built and ruined in a single sentence. Picture the streets of London, taverns filled with chatter, market squares alive with rumour, and palace halls echoing with hushed voices behind fans. In Elizabethan England, beauty was not only a mask of paint and powder, it was a subject of constant surveillance. Every woman's appearance was judged, and every imperfection became a story. The cruelty of beauty standards was sharpened by gossip, which policed women more ruthlessly than any law. Consider a lady stepping into court. Her powder cracks slightly at her jaw, her wig sits a little crooked, her ruff stained faintly with wine. By the time she leaves the hall, whispers ripple outward, her skin is sickly, her hair is false, she cannot control her drink, the gossip spreads faster than disease, carried by servants, rivals, even friends. A woman's body was never her own, it belonged to the eyes that judged it, the tongues that shaped her story. One crack in the mask, and her name could be ruined for months. Whispers thrived because beauty was tied to morality. Pale skin meant chastity, darkened skin suggested lust or labour. Painted lips could be praised as fashionable or condemned as deceitful, depending on who told the story. A woman accused of wearing too much rouge might be branded immoral, while another with too little paint might be mocked as careless. Gossip ensured that women could never win. Whatever choice they made became fodder for ridicule. And gossip was not confined to noble halls. In taverns, men mocked women's wigs, telling jokes of vermin leaping from curls into ale mugs. In marketplaces, wives whispered about neighbours who used too much powder, hinting at vanity. Even among the poor, beauty standards trickled down as stories. She paints herself like a lady, though her purse is empty. Gossip was democracy's cruelty. Everyone could judge, and no one was spared. Servants fueled much of the chatter. They dressed their mistresses, saw the sores hidden beneath paint, carried away linens stained with blood from tight stays. At night in kitchens or streets, they repeated what they'd seen. They told tales of mistresses fainting, of wigs alive with lice, of lovers disgusted by the stench of perfumes. Their stories spread upward again, whispered to other nobles who repeated them as truth. Thus private suffering became public shame. The queen herself was not immune. Whispers about Elizabeth's painted face, her rotting teeth, her wigs, circulated quietly despite the danger. No one dared speak openly, but jokes slipped into plays, and foreign ambassadors reported the truth in coded letters. If gossip could touch the queen, it could destroy anyone. Women lived, knowing their bodies were vulnerable not just to paint and corsets, but to words sharp as knives. One of gossip's cruelties was its permanence. A blemish faded, a wig was replaced, but a rumor lingered. A woman mocked once for bad breath might carry that stain for years, even after her teeth were pulled and perfumed gloves masked the smell. Words clung tighter than powder, harder to wash away than rouge. Reputations became scars written in air. Theatres amplified the cruelty. Playwrights borrowed freely from gossip, turning women's beauty rituals into comedy. Audiences laughed at caricatures of vain ladies powdering their faces, fainting in corsets or chasing suitors with painted lips. But real women saw themselves mocked on stage, their private burdens turned into public entertainment. The cruelty of beauty was magnified by laughter, which cut deeper than paint ever could, and gossip often targeted age. A woman praised for beauty in youth became a subject of pity in later years. Wrinkles, sagging skin, greying hair, each became evidence of decline, whispered about with glee. Men aged into dignity, women aged into ridicule. The cruelty was not simply that beauty faded, but that others delighted in watching it fade. The very court that once praised a woman's face now mocked it, as though her decline was a performance staged for their amusement. But gossip was also weaponized. Women used it against rivals, whispering about rouge applied too thick, or breath too sour, or corsets laced too tight. Gossip became warfare, fought with words instead of swords. In a world where women had little open power, rumor was one of the few tools they wielded. Yet this weapon cut both ways. To use it was to participate in the same cruelty that harmed them all. Survival demanded complicity. Some women resisted by embracing ridicule. A few wore wigs flamboyantly, rouge boldly, daring gossipers to laugh. Their defiance turned mockery into spectacle, reclaiming attention on their own terms. But such rebellion was dangerous. Boldness could be mistaken for immorality, independence for disloyalty. The line between resistance and ruin was as thin as a painted vein. The cruelest whispers were about morality. Beauty was never only surface, it was tied to virtue. A pale, painted woman might be praised as angelic, yet whispered about as deceitful, hiding disease, concealing lust. A woman who fainted might be admired for delicacy, or mocked as weak. Every gesture was reinterpreted, every choice doubled back against her. Gossip turned beauty into a trap, with no escape. And gossip was merciless towards servants who imitated their mistresses. A maid who powdered her face with flour, or reddened her lips with berries, might be mocked as presumptuous, daring to mimic nobility. She thinks herself a lady, they sneered, as though beauty belonged only to the rich. Thus gossip reinforced hierarchy, punishing both those who obeyed standards and those who dared to copy them. In letters you glimpse the cruelty firsthand. Noble women write to friends complaining of slander, of rivals spreading tales about their gowns, their wigs, their bodies. They say I am foul beneath my paint, one laments, though they themselves wear thicker still. Another writes bitterly, the hall is a mirror, but none see themselves, only others to scorn. These voices reveal extras, a weariness deeper than bruises, the fatigue of living beneath constant judgment. Men, of course, wielded gossip as power. A suitor might praise a woman's beauty in one letter, then destroy her reputation with another, if rejected. Husbands whispered about wives to diminish them, securing control. Even poets shaped gossip into art, immortalizing women as metaphors, lily white or foul, angelic or rotten. Words carved women into archetypes, erasing their reality. The cruelty was that gossip turned them into symbols rather than people. Yet gossip also revealed truth. Beneath the laughter and malice, it exposed the contradictions of beauty. Rumors about sores beneath paint, lice in wigs, fainting from corsets. These were not lies, but glimpses of the suffering hidden beneath splendor. Gossip mocked women, but it also betrayed the brutality of the standards themselves. The cruel joke was not on women, but on the system that forced them into such disguises. Still, the system endured, because gossip punished dissent. To speak openly against beauty standards invited ridicule. She mocks paint because she is too ugly for it, they said. Women learned to keep silent, to endure gossip rather than resist it. Silence was survival, and silence allowed cruelty to thrive. So you picture the court again, fans fluttering, lips whispering, eyes darting. Every painted face is a performance not only for mirrors but for rumor. Every smile an act of defense against tongues. The cruelty of Elizabethan beauty was not only in the powders and corsets, but in the endless echo of gossip, which turned women's bodies into stories told by others. Even when the paint washed away at night, the whispers lingered, and as the hall empties and the streets quiet, you realize the noise never truly ends. Gossip clings like perfume, invisible yet suffocating, binding women tighter than any corset. It is the sound of beauty policed not by law or queen, but by neighbours, friends, strangers. In Elizabethan England, the cruelest cage was not made of whalebone or lead. It was made of words. The night air outside the court smells of wood smoke and rain, but step into a crowded alehouse, and you hear the other England, the rough laughter of apprentices, the clatter of mugs, the chatter of women whose hands are red from scrubbing and whose backs ache from labour. Tonight, the focus shifts to those women, servants, peasants, and townsfolk who lived in the shadow of courtly ideals. For them, Elizabethan beauty was not gilded in pearls or framed in portraits. It was a brutal mirror, reminding them of what they could never fully achieve, yet still compelling them to try. Imagine a milkmaid with sun-browned skin staring enviously at a painted noblewoman. Though her work tethered her to the fields, she still longed for the pale, delicate look that the court decreed as beauty. Paleness was the sharpest divide. A noblewoman could afford to stay indoors, her complexion protected by shutters and servants. A poor woman laboured in fields, her cheeks browned by sun and wind. This tan was proof of poverty, not health, and it carried shame. Some women smeared flour on their faces before festivals, desperate to mimic the pallor of ladies. The powder flaked, mixed with sweat, and made them look ghostly in torchlight. Yet still they wore it, because to appear natural was to appear lowly. The cruelty was not just that poor women could not achieve the ideal, it was that they were mocked for failing to achieve what their labour made impossible. Rouge, too, trickled downward. Noble women stained their lips with vermilion, but poorer women crushed berries, rubbed beetroot or elderberries across their mouths. The colour faded quickly, smearing on teeth or hands, drawing laughter rather than admiration. She eats like a pig, someone might whisper, her lips still red with juice, and yet women persisted, because painted lips, however clumsy, gave them a glimpse of the allure otherwise denied them. Beauty was cruel because it dangled hope, a chance to look desirable, but delivered humiliation. Wigs and false locks spread as well, though in humbler form. Market women tied bits of horsehair or their sisters' shed hair into ribbons, pinning it beneath caps. A careless tug might send the bundle slipping, tumbling into mud to the jeers of onlookers, but without the attempt. A woman's thin or coarse hair marked her as common. Beauty was thus a no-win contest, mocked for trying, mocked for not trying. Perfume's cruelty struck the poor hardest. Noble women masked their odour with ambergris and rosewater. Peasants had only vinegar steeped with herbs. At fairs, rosemary water was sold in tin cups, its scent fading within hours. Still, women clutched it, desperate not to be branded foul. To smell of sweat was to invite ridicule, even though labour made sweat inevitable. Imagine working from dawn to dusk, then being judged unworthy for the very scent of your toil. Beauty despised the marks of survival. Corsets and stays, symbols of refinement, were beyond most peasants' reach. But some stitched stiffened bodices with reeds or rope, hoping to mimic the shape. These crude stays bruised their ribs, cut into their skin, yet lacked the elegance of noble whalebone. At dances, their movements looked awkward beside noble guests. The cruelty was sharp. They endured pain equal to that of noble women, but received no admiration, only scorn for failing to achieve perfection. Clothing laws deepened the wound. Sumptuary laws forbade peasants from wearing silk, velvet, or certain colours, marking them visibly as lesser. The serving maid might save for years to buy a bit of velvet trim, only to risk fines if caught wearing it. Thus beauty was literally outlawed for the poor, making aspiration a crime. The cruelty was deliberate, to remind them daily that beauty belonged to the wealthy, and that their bodies were not meant for admiration. Gossip sharpened the divide. In taverns, women mocked neighbours who painted their faces with flour or juice. "She thinks herself a lady," they jeered, reinforcing the ladder that kept everyone in place. Poor women learned quickly that beauty could not free them. It could only bring ridicule from above and below. Their natural skin was condemned, their painted faces mocked. Beauty was not merely unattainable, it was a trap that humiliated any attempt. And yet, longing endured. Girls still gathered wildflowers to braid into their hair, still pinched their cheeks before feast days, still tied scraps of ribbon into gowns. These gestures, small and tender, show that even under cruelty the desire to be seen as beautiful remained. It is the most human part of the story. Even knowing they would be mocked, women still reached for beauty, because beauty promised dignity, if only for a moment. The church sometimes deepened the cruelty. Preachers thundered against paints and powders, calling them sins of vanity. Poor women who mimicked noble fashions risked not only ridicule, but moral condemnation. A painted face, one preacher declared, is the devil's mask. But what choice did they have? To go bare was to be scorned, to paint was to be condemned. Beauty was not simply impossible, it was damned. Letters reveal the quiet pain. A yeoman's wife wrote that she feared her husband's wandering eye, knowing she could not compete with painted courtiers. Another woman lamented her daughter's freckles, praying they might fade in winter lest suitors mock her. These voices reveal how deeply cruelty seeped into marriages, into families, into the bones of ordinary life. Beauty's lash did not spare the countryside, and yet there was humour too. Villagers mocked noble women's farthingales as coops for chickens, laughing at the impracticality. They joked about wigs catching lice and perfumes reeking like dung. Laughter gave them relief, a way to puncture the grandeur that oppressed them. Humour was rebellion, small but real, reminding them they saw through the illusions, even if they could not escape them. But laughter could not erase the weight. Young girls still plucked their brows with crude knives, still smeared flour on their cheeks, still longed for pale, delicate hands. They dreamed of looking like ladies in portraits, even as they knew portraits lied. Beauty's cruelty was strongest in its promises, the suggestion that transformation was possible, even when it never was, and men, as always, judged freely. A farmer's daughter, praised as pretty, might attract a better match. Another scorned for her freckles might languish unmarried. Men expected beauty even from women who laboured beside them, their hands calloused, their backs bent. The double standard was merciless. Men admired the work of women's hands, while scorning the marks of that work on their bodies. Some women turned cruelty into defiance. A few celebrated their strong arms, their brown skin, mocking noble women as fragile dolls. "We work, they faint," they laughed, proud of endurance. Their beauty was not painted, but lived in sweat and survival. These were the rare voices of resistance, rejecting the standards altogether, yet such defiance was fragile. easily drowned by mockery and law. Even children felt the sting. Girls as young as 10 were teased for freckles, crooked teeth, or rough hair. Mothers tried to hide them with powders, teaching cruelty early. A childhood meant for play became a lesson in self-erasure. The cycle began young and never ended, each generation inheriting the same despair. By night, poor women peeled off ribbons, scrubbed berry juice from their mouths, washed flour from their faces. They saw themselves in cracked mirrors or darkened water, their natural faces staring back. Some sighed with relief, others with sorrow. The cruelty of Elizabethan beauty was not only in the poison or corsets of noble halls, but in the way even the poorest women felt compelled to chase ideals designed to exclude them. So you walk through that alehouse again, hearing laughter, smelling sweat, seeing faces flushed with ale and firelight. Some women laugh at their own painted cheeks, some pull scarves tighter to hide freckles, some sit quietly, knowing their worth is measured by standards they will never meet. Beauty trickled down from the Queen's court like poison in water, and even here, far from palaces, it left its bitter taste. And as the night fades, the cruel truth remains. Beauty was not only brutal for noble women in gowns of silk, but for the servants and peasants who mimicked them with scraps and herbs. It was a game designed for them to lose, and yet one they were forced to play. In Elizabethan England, no woman, high or low, could ever escape beauty's cage. The night is quieter now, the echo of gossip fading into the hush of private chambers. But cruelty did not leave women when the court withdrew. It followed them into their basins, their kitchens, their locked chests of recipes. Tonight we move into the world of remedies and superstitions, the potions and powders women reached for in hopes of healing their skin, whitening their hands, or curing the sores left by paint. Imagine a smoky room where herbs hang from beams, jars of strange powders line shelves, and a woman leans over a brass basin, stirring a mixture that steams like a witch's brew. These recipes were not luxuries. They were desperate attempts to survive the standards that tore women's bodies apart. Some recipes were harmless, even sweet. Rosewater, honey, and almond oil were common for softening skin. Women bathed their faces in milk, believing it whitened and smoothed the complexion. Donkey's milk, in particular, was prized. Cleopatra herself was said to have bathed in it, and Elizabethan women copied the legend. Imagine the cost of keeping livestock simply for washing. Even this gentle beauty was burden, demanding labor and wealth to maintain. But many recipes were cruel. Quicklime mixed with vinegar was rubbed on skin to erase freckles, burning flesh beneath. Mercury was blended into pastes to whiten complexions, its poison seeping into bloodstreams. Sulfur was ground into ointments, stinging sores until women cried out. One pamphlet advised scrubbing skin with urine to remove blemishes. Another suggested rubbing pigeon's blood on cheeks for color. These remedies were desperation disguised as medicine. The cruelty was that women, already injured by beauty standards, injured themselves further trying to repair the damage. Superstitions made the burden stranger still. Some believed that standing under the full moon would bleach the skin, so women sat outside at night, faces tilted to the sky, shivering in cold dew. Others carried amulets of herbs, trusting rosemary to keep their skin clear, sage to brighten eyes, lavender to sweeten breath. These rituals gave comfort, but also revealed despair. Women clutched at anything, no matter how illogical, if it promised a glimpse of beauty. Freckles in particular were hated. They were marks of sun, proof of labor, and thus scorned. Women used bizarre cures, rubbing snail slime across their faces, pressing slices of raw veal against their cheeks, or applying mixtures of sulfur and wine. The smell alone must have been unbearable, yet still they endured, because freckles branded them unfashionable. Imagine lying in bed at night with raw meat strapped to your face, hoping to wake prettier. Beauty's cruelty was not subtle, it was grotesque. Teeth were another battlefield. Recipes for tooth powders included crushed oyster shells, pumice or brick dust, which stripped enamel until gums bled. To sweeten breath, women chewed cloves, but others gargled with vinegar or even sulfuric mixtures that corroded their mouths. The smile might glitter for a time, but beneath, pain throbbed. The cruelty was not only in the remedies but in the lies. Cures that promised beauty destroyed it instead. Even hair had its rituals. To lighten locks, women soaked them in lye or urine, then baked them in the sun until they burned brittle. To thicken hair, they rubbed goose fat into scalps, leaving them greasy for days. To prevent grey, they applied mixtures of lead combs and vinegar, poisoning themselves slowly. Each strand became a reminder that beauty demanded constant negotiation with discomfort, danger, and absurdity. And yet, these recipes travelled as secrets between women. Mothers whispered them to daughters, friends traded them like charms, servants carried them from house to house. There was intimacy in the cruelty, a sense of solidarity even while suffering. Imagine two women leaning close, one confessing her latest concoction, the other laughing despite the sting. The pain became bearable because it was shared. Not all remedies came from apothecaries. Cunning folk, village healers, sold powders and potions, mixing superstition with medicine. They offered ointments of pig's fat to smooth wrinkles, charms to keep lips red, talismans to preserve pale skin. Some even sold potions claiming to prevent age itself. Desperate women bought them, hoping for miracles, but miracles never came. Only more bruises, more burns, more expense. The cruelty was in hope itself, endlessly sold, never delivered. Religion complicated matters. Priests condemned many remedies as vanity, branding women sinful for painting their faces or seeking magical cures. A woman who rubbed snail slime on her skin might be mocked as foolish, but one who carried an amulet might be whispered about as a witch. Superstition offered no safety. Its practices could soothe or condemn depending on who spoke of them. Women lived in constant fear of being mocked as vain or accused as sorceresses, and yet the Queen herself encouraged extremes. Elizabeth's physicians concocted special pastes for her skin, perfumes for her breath, oils for her hair. If the Queen painted her face with poisons and wore amulets of herbs, then so must her courtiers. The monarchy's endorsement gave dangerous remedies legitimacy. Women followed the example not because they believed in safety, but because survival meant imitation. The cruelty stretched into economics. Remedies cost money: rosewater, mercury, snail slime, honey, wine. Poor women spent coins they could not spare, hoping to erase freckles or brighten lips. Families went without bread, so daughters could buy powders. Beauty consumed not only bodies but livelihoods, draining households into apothecaries' jars. Poverty sharpened the cruelty. Those least able to afford beauty paid the dearest price. Satirists mocked the absurdities. Pamphlets described women with faces smeared in goose fat or hair reeking of urine. Plays poked fun at women who boiled pigeons for paint. Audiences laughed, but women did not. The ridicule only deepened shame, reminding them that their efforts to meet impossible standards would always be mocked as foolish. Humor was another lash in beauty's whip. Still, women clung to remedies because they offered a sliver of control. A woman might not change her freckles or her rotting teeth, but she could try. The act of mixing a potion, of painting a face, gave hope. And hope, however cruel, was powerful. To do nothing felt like surrender. To smear snail slime across skin felt like fighting back, however absurd the battle. Some remedies were not about beauty, but recovery from beauty's damage. Recipes promised to heal burns from lye, sores from corsets, ulcers from lead paint. Women harmed themselves to appear beautiful, then harmed themselves again trying to heal. It was a cycle of cruelty, injury, remedy, injury again. And yet, to break the cycle was unthinkable, for bare skin was more shameful than scars. The cruelty of superstition lay in its false comfort. Women believed freckles would fade with veal, that hair would thicken with goose fat, that lips would glow with pigeon's blood. They believed because they needed to believe, because hope was easier than despair. But every morning the freckles remained, the hair thinned, the lips cracked. Superstition fed them hope while feeding on their despair. And still, women passed remedies on. Daughters inherited their mothers' recipes like heirlooms, believing the same snail slime that failed their mothers might succeed for them. Generation after generation repeated the same futile rituals, bound together by cruelty disguised as tradition. Even failure became legacy, carried lovingly like a curse. So you sit in that smoky room again, jars and herbs scattered on the table, a woman leaning over her basin. Her face burns with quicklime, her hair reeks of vinegar, her lips sting with rouge. She believes she is making herself beautiful, but she is only carving deeper wounds. Yet she smiles faintly in the mirror, because for one night, under candlelight, she might appear fair. That hope is the cruelest remedy of all. And when dawn comes, the jars remain, waiting to be opened again. Remedies never cured, they only prolonged the suffering. Superstitions never saved, they only deepened the trap. In Elizabethan England, beauty was not only painted on skin, it was brewed in pots, stirred in basins, whispered in recipes that promised miracles and delivered misery. The candles gutter low, casting thin shadows across painted faces, and at last we turn from the powders and poisons to the lives lived beneath them. Tonight the focus falls on the mask itself, not the lead, the rouge, or the corset, but the hidden truths of the women who wore them. Imagine a lady returning to her chamber after hours in the Queen's Hall. The door closes, servants withdraw, and she sits before a mirror. With a damp cloth she scrapes away powder, rouge, the faint painted veins. Beneath, the reflection is harsher, sores from lead, teeth darkened by sugar, hairline thinned by plucking. This is the self no courtier is meant to see, the face stripped bare of illusion. And yet within those moments of honesty, resistance flickers, for the mask was not simply submission, it was survival, and sometimes survival itself is defiance. To wear the mask was to endure contradiction. A woman painted herself because she had to please the Queen, to attract suitors, to silence gossip. But inside, she might scorn it. Diaries from the period hint at this duality. One lady wrote that she despised the paint, yet could not be without it. Another confessed that she prayed for forgiveness each night after rouge, fearing vanity as sin, but fearing ridicule more. The mask created two selves, the public, powdered angel, and the private, weary woman who hated the ritual. Beauty's cruelty was not only on the skin, it was in this tearing apart of self. But resistance showed itself in small ways. Some women wore less paint than expected, letting freckles show faintly as quiet rebellion. Others exaggerated their paint, parodying the ideal with crimson lips too bright, veins too dark, daring anyone to laugh. Still others laughed privately, mocking their own faces in mirrors, knowing they obeyed but refusing to respect the standard. These were not revolutions, but they were refusals to be fully conquered. Sometimes defiance comes not in breaking the cage, but in smirking inside it. The mask also offered power, however cruel its cost. Painted faces could entrance, distract, or disarm. A woman who mastered the illusion might win suitors, sway politics, or shield secrets. Behind the mask, she could conceal exhaustion, illness, even disdain. Think of Elizabeth herself. Her mask of paint and wigs concealed the frailty of age, sustaining the illusion of eternal strength. Her courtiers learned the lesson. A painted face could be armor as well as shackle. The cruelty was that women wielded power only through suffering, only by hiding themselves beneath poison. And yet, cracks in the mask brought vulnerability. A laugh too wide and powder flaked. A sneeze and rouge smeared. A tear and coal ran. These small betrayals reminded women that their power was fragile, dependent on constant vigilance. No matter how strong they were beneath, they lived in fear of the moment their illusion failed. Beauty standards did not merely demand pain, they demanded ceaseless attention. The mask was never off, even when it was. Some women turned the mask into performance, exaggerating faintness or fragility to manipulate expectations. A swoon at the right moment might attract sympathy or distract a rival. A painted smile could hide anger. A powdered brow could feign innocence. This was resistance too, though hidden, using the tools of cruelty as weapons against the very system that demanded them. Beauty forced women to act, but they learned to direct their roles, turning victimhood into strategy. But there were women who resisted more openly. Some scorned paint entirely, choosing simplicity as virtue. Preachers praised them, but society mocked them as dowdy, unattractive, failures in the marriage market. Their resistance cost them prospects, fortunes, sometimes safety. Still, their refusal left ripples, whispers of another possibility. Their faces became quiet testaments that beauty did not always win, though the price of that defiance was heavy. Letters and poems reveal the exhaustion. "The mirror is my enemy," one woman wrote. "It shows me not myself, but what I lack." Another lamented, "Each morning I paint, each night I bleed. Who shall see me as I am?" Beneath the powder, beneath the laughter and dance was grief. The grief of being unseen, of living life as a portrait rather than a person. The cruelty of the mask was erasure, the silencing of truth beneath layers of lie. And yet, even within cruelty, beauty could be shared joy. Women painted together, laughed over smeared rouge, borrowed each other's powders. In those private moments, the mask became less burden and more bond. They mocked suitors who praised them without realizing their faces were false, teasing one another about who looked most like a ghost. These shared jokes softened the cruelty, turning suffering into solidarity. The mask was prison, but it was also community. The mask was also protection. In a world that judged harshly, a bare face was vulnerability. Paint offered distance, a shield between a woman's true self and the world's scorn. It was deception, yes, but also survival. Better to be mocked for false beauty than pitied for plainness. The cruelty was that women were forced to choose which wound they preferred, ridicule or invisibility. Neither path was free, but at least the mask allowed some control over how the wound was shaped. Some used the mask to hide rebellion. Beneath powdered faces, women passed notes, plotted intrigues, whispered seditions. They smiled while betraying rivals, curtsied while concealing anger. The mask concealed not just flaws but thoughts, desires, schemes. Men might see dolls, but beneath the chalk and rouge burned sharp minds. Beauty's cruelty created masks, but those masks sometimes hid daggers. Yet there was tragedy too. Many women forgot their own faces, seeing only the mask in mirrors. Smallpox scars, freckles, wrinkles, erased daily until they themselves believed they were ugly, unworthy, unless painted. They lived haunted by the mask, unable to imagine beauty without it. The cruelty became internal, not just forced from outside, but embraced, believed, repeated in their own hearts. That is the deepest wound of beauty standards, when oppression becomes self-criticism. Even in portraits, the mask dominates. Painters immortalize the illusion, smooth brows, pale cheeks, crimson lips. Generations later, we admire the elegance, forgetting the suffering. We see dignity, not sores, grandeur, not bruises. The portraits lie beautifully, erasing truth. Women who lived complex, painful lives are remembered as masks, their humanity hidden beneath paint. The cruelty of the mask outlasted even their deaths, and yet one can imagine moments of rebellion, a woman wiping her face with a sigh of relief, whispering to herself, "This is me," another laughing with friends at the absurdity of painted veins, another envying her daughter a simpler remedy, gentler than lead. These sparks remind us that cruelty never fully consumed them. The mask might hide them, but it could not erase them entirely. Think of the lower classes again, borrowing flour for powder or berries for rouge. Their masks cracked quicker, revealed sooner, but even they embraced illusion. For one night at a festival, one moment at a dance, they too could appear elegant. The cruelty was democratic, masks for rich and poor alike, each paying a different price for the same false promise. The mask also revealed hypocrisy. Men mocked women for painting, yet demanded beauty. They praised the illusion, then scorned the artifice. They courted the mask while rejecting the truth beneath. Women learned quickly that the mask was not for themselves, but for others' comfort. The cruelty was that beauty was never about self-expression. It was about obedience to desire not their own. And still resilience endured. Beneath masks, women carried stories, strength, wit. They endured poison and pain, yet governed households, raised children, influenced politics. They wore masks because they had to, but they lived beyond them. The cruelty of beauty standards scarred them, but it did not erase their humanity. To see only the mask is to underestimate the women who survived beneath it. So you picture that woman at her mirror once more. The paint is gone, the sores revealed, the lips pale. She touches her face gently, perhaps with sadness, perhaps with defiance. Tomorrow the mask will return, but tonight she is herself. Beneath the cruelty lies persistence, the stubborn refusal to vanish, even when the world demands disguise. And as the candle burns low, you realize this. The painted mask was both prison and shield, cruelty and resistance, erasure and survival. It hid women, hurt them, mocked them, but it also preserved them, gave them space to endure. Beauty was brutal, yes, but the women beneath the mask were tougher still. Their stories remind us not to trust the paint, but to see the strength it tried and failed to conceal. The hall is hushed now, the candles guttering lower, the painted faces fading into shadow. Tonight we walk into the last chamber of this long journey, the fading candlelight of Elizabethan beauty, where cruelty and splendor mingle one final time before dissolving into silence. You imagine the Queen's palace growing quiet after a feast, the perfumes lingering like ghosts, the wigs removed, the ruffs unpinned, the rouge wiped away. Women sit in their chambers, mirrors clouded by smoke, basins filled with dirty rosewater. Their bodies ache, ribs bruised from corsets, skin raw from lime, lips cracked from vermilion, scalps itching from wigs. In these private hours the illusion collapses, and what remains is the truth, that Elizabethan beauty was a mask built of suffering, endured for survival, never for joy. The cruelty of it all rests not just in the paints and powders, but in the demand itself, that women must erase their humanity to appear acceptable. Pale skin meant you were noble, though it burned with poison. Crimson lists meant a law, though they bled beneath. Painted veins meant fragility, though they were drawn with coal. The ruff meant elegance, though it scraped the neck raw. Every standard required harm, and every harm was rewarded as virtue. To be natural was to be scorned, to be beautiful was to be broken, and yet it was not only the Queen's court that enforced this cage. Gossip in streets, pamphlets in theatres, whispers in churches, all joined to maintain the illusion beauty was public property, women's faces for society's judgment. They lived in fear not of their own reflection, but of others' tongues. To falter was to be mocked, shamed, diminished. The cruelty was communal, woven into every eye and every word. Think of the poor again, women who mimicked the standards with flour, berries, vinegar. They knew they would fail, yet still they tried. A milkmaid smeared elderberry on her lips, only for it to smear across her teeth. A servant dusted flour on her face, only to sweat it off in kitchens. Their attempts were mocked, yet their failure was inevitable. Beauty was a game rigged for them to lose, and still they played, because the desire to be seen as worthy was stronger than reason. Even for the wealthy, success was fleeting. A lady praised one year for her pale skin might be mocked, the next for her wrinkles. A courtier admired for her gown might be scorned when fashion changed. The cruelty of beauty lay in its impermanence. It demanded daily sacrifice yet never offered permanence. Women were trapped in a cycle of endless striving. Their efforts erased each morning, their pain renewed each night. Religion added another lash. Preachers thundered that painted women sinned, that powders mocked God's creation, that rouge invited the devil. Yet the same preachers admired noble ladies in courts, praised their beauty as heavenly. Women lived in contradiction, condemned if they painted, condemned if they did not. The cruelty was doubled. A woman's body was damned either way, caught between sin and scorn. And yet, beneath all this, women endured with resilience. They laughed at their own cracked paint, mocked their wigs, shared recipes, exchanged secrets. They whispered jokes in chambers, turned fainting into performance, found strength, sent solidarity. Cruelty could not erase their wit, their humor, their defiance. Even as they suffered, they carved spaces of resistance, small flames flickering in the dark. The Queen herself embodied both sides. Elizabeth's mask was the heaviest of all. Endless paint, endless wigs, endless jewels. She bore the same poisons as her courtiers, yet wielded them as power. Her illusion of eternal youth became England's strength. The Virgin Queen's body transformed into symbol of empire, but the cost was personal. In her later years she sat alone, teeth blackened, hair gone, her face scarred beneath paint. The cruelty of beauty consumed even its greatest master. The portraits remain frozen illusions of splendor. We look at them now and see elegance, majesty, grace, but we must learn to see deeper, to imagine the sores beneath the paint, the bruises beneath the silk, the exhaustion behind the eyes. These women were not statues but flesh and blood, enduring daily pain to appear eternal. The cruelty of beauty was that it erased their humanity not only in life but in memory, and yet their survival is proof of strength. They endured poison and ridicule, yet governed estates, raised children, navigated politics. They lived entire lives beneath masks, but they lived them nonetheless. Stubbornly and fiercely, beauty hurt them, mocked them, consumed them, but it did not erase them. To remember them now is to honor their endurance, to look past the paint and see the women who bore it. Think of the contradictions. Women painted veins to appear fragile, though they were strong enough to manage households. They fainted in corsets, yet rose to command servants. They wore wigs crawling with lice, yet outlasted plagues. They endured cruelty, yet carved lives out of it. The beauty standards were brutal, but the women beneath them were tougher still. The cruelty lives on in echoes. Today we scroll through images filtered smooth, lips tinted, brows arched, skin erased of pores. The tools are different, but the demand the same. Erase yourself, become an illusion, perform fragility. Elizabethan women painted with lead and vermilion. We paint with pixels. The cage remains, only gilded with new bars. Their suffering is not distant history, but familiar shadow. And so, as the night deepens, we soften the pace. The corridors grow still, the perfumes fade, the wigs lie discarded. Women sit in silence, their faces bare, their shoulders aching, their mirrors clouded. They touch their skin gently, remembering it beneath paint, and for a moment they are themselves again. These quiet hours before dawn's demands return are their only freedom. Cruelty rests, but only briefly. You close your eyes and imagine the hush of an Elizabethan bedchamber, the crackle of embers, the rustle of linen, the sigh of a woman stretching her ribs after stays are removed. Outside, the court still buzzes with gossip, but here there is peace. For a few hours, she need not paint her face or pluck her brows. She can sleep as herself, scars and all. Beauty is cruel, but sleep is merciful. Now let the candle burn low. Let the paint pots close, the wigs rest, the corsets unlace. Let the perfumes fade into air. leaving only the scent of wood smoke and night. The cruel rituals of beauty are done for the day, their scars hidden in darkness. Tomorrow the cycle will begin again, but tonight there is reprieve. Tonight the body is allowed to be body, not mask. You'd probably never make it through a single medieval or Elizabethan night, not with the poisons, the perfumes, the corsets, the gossip. But don't worry, you're safe here. Safe to imagine, safe to reflect, safe to let their suffering drift into history's quiet. So before the final light fades, if this long company has kept you steady, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right in your heart. And perhaps before sleep, you might share where you are listening from, a crowded city awake in neon, or a quiet room in the countryside. These stories remind us that we are never alone in the dark. Now dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, slow your breathing, picture the women of Elizabeth's England setting aside their masks at last, lying down in silence, their painted faces forgotten for a few hours. Let that image soothe you, that beneath cruelty there was always humanity, that beneath masks there were always women who endured. Let the candle gutter, let the night deepen, let the story fade into quiet. And so our journey ends, not with paint or powder, but with stillness. Close your eyes and let the voices of the past fade like smoke, leaving only calm. You are safe now. The masks are gone, the candles out, the cruelty dissolved into history. Sleep comes softly, and we end together, here on Timeless Sleep. Good night, sweet